All right, well, I'm going to get started with our workshop today. My name is Jeff Stone. I'm a research manager with the Association of State Floodplain Managers in the Flood Science Center for ASFPM. And on the screen there, you can kind of see our website as well if you want to contact us. And we'll be sharing some more information throughout the day and some other links as well. And so this is the applications of no adverse impact floodplain management for the lower Rio Grande Valley, and it's an NAI CHARM resiliency workshop. And NAI is no adverse impact, and CHARM, of course, stands for Community Health and Resource Management. And we're going to be learning, you're going to get all the information about both of these approaches to floodplain management and moving towards higher standards in floodplain management, kind of moving beyond FEMA's minimum standards for floodplain management. This funding, there is funding for this workshop from FEMA. And of course, we're working with a lot of partners and a lot of team members from the Texas Community Watershed Partners, the CHARM developers, and the great team that we have from there. Also with the Coastal States Organization. You're going to hear a few words from John Ryan Henry shortly from that organization, and then also Texas Sea Grant. And really, as we've been putting this together, the overall goal is to, like I mentioned, implementing those higher floodplain management standards through no adverse impact approach. And that's kind of the morning session. You're going to hear a lot about the NAI, what it is, especially from the planning kind of realm. And then in the afternoon, we're going to test out some of those approaches using CHARM and through the interactive mapping exercises, using data from the region. And so you're going to hear a lot more about that from Steve as well as he explains what that is and getting into the mapping exercises. So definitely be part of the afternoon exercise where you take what you learned in the morning and apply it in the afternoon. We do have a workshop event page, and the link is there at the bottom. I would appreciate if anybody could take the link that there, Jason, maybe, and put our link for the workshop event page into the chat box. And what that's going to allow you to do, if you haven't downloaded all the materials for the workshop, you can get the agenda there, you can get the speaker bios. There's going to be, for this afternoon's sessions with the exercises, the legend and score sheet for CHARM, and then CHARM flooding types and descriptions, along with all the other resources that you're going to hear about from the how-to guides and other legal resources are all going to be available on that website. So you can download things from that. And once this workshop is over, you'll be able to download all the presentations that you're going to see. And as we get the recordings, post the recordings. Quickly, for those that aren't familiar with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, we do have a kind of simple mission, but a lot of work behind it. But it's a two-part mission, just to reduce the losses of life and property due to flooding, while also protecting the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains. And so I just had found some of these pictures from the area, from the lower Rio Grande Valley. I think that kind of just highlight those costs and damages due to flooding, but also where the natural barriers can really help protect coastal infrastructure and other infrastructure and help reduce the impacts of flooding. So ASFPM has 18,000 members nationally, and that includes individual national members, but also members through our chapters. We have over 10,000 certified floodplain managers, and this is done through 37 state and regional chapters that you're seeing on the map on your screen. And especially want to highlight that the Texas Floodplain Management Association, the chapter in Texas, and the link up there for that organization for your Texas chapter. A lot of great resources through the Texas chapter and people that are able to help, just on state level issues and really have the knowledge for Texas as well. Bit of workshop housekeeping, if you will. Everybody's coming in on mute, so please try to stay muted while you're joining the sessions. You can also have your webcam on or off. If you have low bandwidth, you can turn off your camera. It should help. But no need to have your camera on the whole time, but we do like seeing faces, so happy if you can join us with the webcam on. There is a chat box for questions. The speakers, as we go through today, will be talking for about 20-25 minutes with about 5 minutes for questions, about half hour total for everybody. Please hold off any verbal questions. You're welcome to come off mute and ask questions when they are complete. But if you have questions while they're talking, go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll track those and we can make sure or try to get the speakers to answer those questions given time. If you need help during any of the discussions, go ahead and also use the chat for that. And it's just for technical issues and we'll try to get that figured out for you. We have a great team helping with that. And when we get to the lunch break, please feel free to stay logged in through lunch so you don't have to rejoin and maybe have some challenges there. Finally, on the kind of continuing education credits for this, we are offering the 5 credits for both the CFMs, the Certified Floodplain Managers, and for planners, the AICPs. You do have to participate for the full day. We're going to be monitoring, tracking people just to make sure everybody's staying for the full day. For the ASFPM credits, we will apply those automatically for anybody that has indicated they would like those credits. And APA will have a link for you to be able to get those continuing credits for the AICP. And these credits are for people that are already certified planners or floodplain managers and have had taken the tests and are ready to receive those credits. And my last slide before I'm going to hand it off to a few other folks is just a quick overview of the day. We're obviously in the kind of introductions and overview session right now, but I mentioned we are going to start out with kind of a no adverse impact overview, and we're going to hear from Terri Turner on that. Then we're going to go into the legal foundations of no adverse impact with Jerry Murphy, and we're going to move out to the coast a little bit and hear more on the legal community liability with local government and sea level rise and future conditions and coastal infrastructure from Thomas Ruppert, then move back inland with Larry Dunbar and hear more about flooding and property rights in the inland area. And then hearing from Ataul, Hannan on just the Harris County Flood Control District's engineering and modeling map maintenance system, management system. So a great lineup for this morning that will all feed and give you the information to use in the afternoon sessions with the exercises with the CHARM platform. And what I'd like to do right now, this workshop really came out of some work with the Coastal States organization that we were part of. And I want to hand it off to John Ryan Henry just to kind of talk about how this kind of culminated and kind of how we ended up where we are today, but with a lot of work with Willacy and Cameron County and kind of expanding out to the whole valley in that way. But John, I'd love to hear from you a little bit and kind of explain, how we got to this point.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff, and thank you to Steve and Reza and all the many people that were involved in bringing this workshop to fruition. Very excited to be involved with this. I'm sorry we can't meet in person and all gather around a table to do mapping exercises together. But I am glad that we're able to move to this online format, especially if doing so has expanded the reach of who is able to attend and participate. So we're absolutely glad about that. We're glad this is happening. My name is John Ryan Henry. I'm a resilience specialist at the Coastal Organization. CSO is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we represent the states and the coastal states and territories of the United States, including Gulf states, East and West Coast, Great Lakes, and the Atlantic and Pacific Islands. We're very glad to be participating in this because, as Jeff said, this is a culmination and a continuation of work that's been going on for some time, and at least this part of the partnership began in late 2018 when a team of folks from Willacy and Cameron County came together to participate in the Strengthening Coastal Counties Resilience Project. That was a strategic planning and technical assistance effort that was a joint project between the National Association of Counties, ASFPM, CSO, and our federal partners at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And through that effort, a core team of folks in Cameron and Willacy, as well as key partners in managing the coast, came together to develop a 3-year multi-county coastal resilience strategy that identified existing data and the gaps in that data, prioritized on shared issues, and coordinated on ongoing and future studies and projects to manage risk in a way that's holistic and responding to the full scope of the issue rather than to the political boundaries between the counties. That effort culminated in 2019 when we were actually able to meet in person on South Padre Island, together with teams from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida, to share lessons learned and find commitments for the partnership going forward. I think the main success that came out of that effort was that the partnership triggered between the two counties has really spread to encompass the COG, Hidalgo, and all the key partners in the lower Rio Grande Valley to identify and cooperate on these shared coastal risk issues. And so this workshop is a follow-on from that partnership effort and is helping push towards understanding and identifying not only the issues, but strategies for confronting those issues moving forward. And I think it does a great job of capturing how all of the different players that are responsible for coordinating in the Valley together to confront these issues can work together and find strategies together. So very excited to be participating. Thank you everyone who's come on, who's helped spread the word about this workshop and who'll be participating all day, not only for the great educational content up front that I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from, but also for that key workshop component in the second half of the agenda to really dig into data that is from communities in the Valley and looking at opportunities for management options going forward. So thanks so much.
Thanks, John. And before I let Steve say a few words, I do want to mention that by my count, this is the 8th workshop that Steve and I and ASFPM and the Texas Community Watershed Partner Team have done a workshop similar to this. So we've been working on this for over the years. This is our 2nd virtual workshop. So it is really a nice marriage of NAI and CHARM, and CHARM really does hit the NAI approach with its higher standards, and the way you interact with CHARM is really just fits so nicely into what NAI is. You know, so I'm going to let Steve say a few more words about how we work together and some thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to Terri once Steve is done. And I'll quit sharing my screen, Steve, while you're talking, and then let Terri get connected.
Sounds good. We'll get her situated. So thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I was thinking this morning as well how long we've been coordinating and working together and to provide these workshops and a couple of different projects to make this happen. So we've been working around the country and multiple states to bring this program. And I would say that the list of speakers that we have this morning really is an A+ team. It's an incredible lineup. I'm looking forward to hearing more. And I want to point out for our folks here participating, we really are going to turn the corner after lunch and work with some technology that we've developed over the last few years. And it's a chance for both technical and non-technical people to kind of come together to think about the ideas that we will hear this morning and how that may apply to the issues that you're seeing in your communities and that you are hearing about. And of course, it's important that we have data to help support these conversations. So I think you'll see very quickly how the CHARM approach and platform helps integrate very nicely the ideas behind NAI, as well as local participants around the community. So I'll talk a little bit more this afternoon about CHARM. So we could spend a lot of time talking about the data, but really another key component for this is public participation. And as we built and designed CHARM over the years, it was always geared towards working with a non-technical public audience so that communities around the state could engage with local officials and stakeholders to work on these things. And that's really such a key part. And we're really happy to be able to provide basically a customized application here today for Willacy and Cameron counties. And I will share with y'all that all the participants here, it may sound intimidating, I promise you, it's going to be a fun exercise. Think of SimCity, but a little bit different, maybe peek into the future, and get a chance to think about perhaps some strategies and planning ideas and what the next 10, 20 years might bring. So so I think it's a good compliment from the speakers that we have this morning, and then be able to roll that into the technology this afternoon. So we'll definitely shift gears. On that note, I'm going to pause. Thank you, Jeff. And we'll talk more this afternoon, and look forward to sharing more. So thank you all.
Thanks, Steve. And Terri, are you able to go ahead and share your screen? And while you're doing that, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. We have provided the biographies for all of our speakers, but Terri Turner is a planner and a floodplain manager, is a development service administrator with the city of Augusta, Georgia, in their planning and development department. And Terry's going to give you the overview of No Adverse Impact, but Terri is also the co-chair of the No Adverse Impact Committee, Policy Committee for ASFPM. So she is the expert on this. And so with that, Terri, I'm going to hand it off to you, and thanks, Terri.
Good morning and howdy, y'all. I can't tell you how very excited I am to be kicking off this NAI Charm Resiliency Workshop. Even more exciting is being able to come, albeit virtually, to an area I've spent many wonderful hours in. I'm blessed to have family living in Hidalgo County in the beautiful town of Weslaco, and also family in Monte Alto. And I've been there enough times to know that the area is actually called the Valley. Texas high school football is something that defies human imagination. And if you want truly authentic Mexican food, it's in the homes there. It's not at the Taco Bell like it is here. The lower Rio Grande Valley is a beautiful area that has everything from coastline on the eastern part of the valley to miles and miles of gorgeous farmland in between, and then hills on the western part of the valley. While the valley is a highly desirable place to live and work and visit, it's seen its share of flooding, especially in recent years. I know my family in Weslaco, for instance, has had at least 2 major flood events in the last 3 years. Just like everywhere in the U.S., the valley is seeing rapid growth, and with that growth comes challenges, just like it does anywhere in the U.S. I'm sure you found yourself asking at some point, how do we grow and how do we do that without causing negative impacts? Let's look at flooding, for example. Under the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, there are a few restrictions to where we build. There's no protection of floodplains and wetlands and other sensitive areas. And probably the most hideous of all, fill is allowed to be placed in the especially hazardous portion of the floodplain known as the special flood hazard area. So even if we're following the rules of the federal government through the NFIP and think we're doing everything right, we may in actuality be allowing development that causes harm to our area and to others. This isn't meant to discredit the NFIP, and I don't want to give the pretense of doing that. Let's not forget the NFIP is an insurance program. It's not a land management program, and quite frankly, it's the only land management program some communities have when it comes to regulating flooding. But that, I think, is just a little scary. So let's look at the floodplain. The slide here depicts your normal floodplain, your typical floodplain. Today's floodplain is not necessarily tomorrow's floodplain, however. The floodplain in this slide looks pretty pristine. Development, which consists of new housing and industry on the slide, is occurring outside of the special flood hazard area. And if you as a community prevent new development and fill in the special flood hazard area, then you are keeping existing development safe and hopefully free from from flooding. Many people don't realize that fill within the special flood hazard area increases flood elevations both upstream and downstream. As less land becomes available for development in communities, there's a great pressure put on planners and elected officials to allow development in sensitive areas, such as floodplains, as you see here. But these areas really shouldn't be developed in. To get their site to work for their building, fill's often brought in from off-site. That's where the trouble begins. Filling in the floodplain changes the whole dynamics of the special flood hazard area. Again, both upstream and downstream. Area that was once able to process and convey flood waters is no longer there. It's been filled in. And this illustration is a prime example of what development does when it alters what currently exists in our floodplains. It squeezes the floodplain into a smaller channel. It's the same amount of flood water, but it's got less room to maneuver and to get out and down to a lower area. So what do you think happens then? Homes and businesses that were previously not subject to flooding now suffer flood damages and a great financial loss due to negative impacts of floodwaters. And what do you think potentially happens upstream? Well, all that fill acts like a dam, backing floodwaters up onto those areas that were there long before the fill happened downstream of them. And what about downstream of this location? Well, you're right. Increased velocities, increased erosion and sedimentation. Flooding causes havoc downstream, all because fill was allowed in an area that should have been left alone to naturally carry floodwaters during a flood event. I hope you're asking yourself right now, what's the solution? So a whole lot of people, a whole lot smarter than me, got together in 1977, I'm told on the back of a napkin, but don't quote me there, and formed the Association of State Floodplain Managers. ASFPM is a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing flood loss in the nation. We accomplish this mission by educating policyholders on sound floodplain management, on policies, on practices, on improving the knowledge of floodplain managers, and we can do this through our Certified Floodplain Manager program, on delivering professional development to people like you through courses like we're presenting today, and training events all over the nation. We conduct applied research. We develop tools that address all aspects of flooding and floodplain management. And we even work to increase international awareness of flooding and flood loss reduction. Like Jeff said earlier, we have over 18,000 members. They come from a variety of backgrounds, including local, state, and federal government, engineers, politicians, city managers, higher education researchers, professionals at all walks of life that have to do with stormwater, flooding, engineering, you name it. We're a very diverse group. And our headquarters for ASFPM is located in Madison, Wisconsin. So ASFPM's vision is an adaptable nation resilient to flooding and prepared for tomorrow's changing climate. It's a task much easier said than done, however. So our mission, like Jeff mentioned earlier, is to promote education, policies, and activities that mitigate current and future flood losses, but also to reduce the cost and human suffering caused by flooding. And while we're doing that, we want to protect the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains, all without causing adverse impacts. To see their mission become a reality in 2003, ASFPM came to a common sense approach to floodplain management, and they called it no adverse impact. So I love the preamble to the no adverse impact toolkit that you see here on the screen. What those in the industry sometimes refer to as the playbook of floodplain management. It says, while awaiting perfection, and in our case, that perfection is the elimination of flooding everywhere, Just do what's possible. No adverse impact management is certainly possible in our local communities today. So, what is no adverse impact? Well, it's an approach, a philosophy, a way of thinking, a concept, marching orders, if you would, that ensures that we don't harm one another with development. NAI is locally owned and locally driven. Impacts of proposed development will be acknowledged, evaluated not only at the source, but within the entire watershed, and they'll be accounted for in mitigation measures to reduce or eliminate the negative impacts of the development being proposed. It's truly a comprehensive strategy for reducing flood risk and the negative consequences of flooding, such as loss of life and loss of property, not to mention the enormous costs associated with damage from flood events. NAI is big picture thinking. It doesn't just address the property being developed, but any and all properties that will be affected by the development, and actually brings them into consideration during the planning process. It looks not only at the flood risks, but stormwater runoff, potential erosion and sedimentation, whether or not the access to the development could be cut off during a flood event, and things such as that, and what the consequences of flooding will be on this project and on the area around it. It takes into account all properties, not just the property being developed, and that's why it's so important. So if the development does have adverse impacts, well, it's back to the drawing board to come up with a solution that's good for everybody, that doesn't cause adverse impacts and doesn't cause potential harm. If there are to be impacts, or if impacts are just plain unavoidable, then there has to be appropriate mitigation to offset those negative impacts. That mitigation must be acceptable to the community as the regulating authority, but it also has to be acceptable to the property owners being affected by the proposed development. It's not just about the developer. So NAI is about equality. It's about property rights, not just the property rights of the developer, but the property rights of adjoining property owners, both upstream and downstream. It takes everyone's property rights into consideration, and it makes sure that development is done in a fair and equitable manner. NAI has been tested in the courts and has been found to be reasonable, equitable, and aimed at the rights of all. Two of our ASFPM legal gurus, as I like to call them, Jerry Murphy and Thomas Ruppert, will be talking to you later this morning more about NAI and its legal implications. I'll tell you that it's working in communities, both big communities and small communities. It's easily understandable, it's easily implementable, it's easily defendable, and it's extremely sustainable. So, all stormwater related aspects of your community will be touched by utilizing the no adverse impact approach to your floodplain management needs. And all aspects of your community stormwater management and floodplain management programs will benefit if you choose to use NAI. So NAI is a bottom-up approach. It's not top-down like so many regulations we get in our local communities. But the federal government and the state government can and often do play a huge role in making it successful, especially in the regulatory process. A great example would be when your state adopts higher regulatory standards, such as increased freeboard, like we have here in Georgia. The feds also play a role, in particular FEMA, and they're constantly putting out new technical bulletins that provide guidance for complying with the minimum NFIP floodplain management requirements that apply to buildings. And then FEMA's floodplain management bulletins kind of pick up everything else and provide guidance on administering the NFIP requirements that apply to development other than buildings, although they do address some building standards as well. So The local government is where the rubber meets the road. It's where all meaningful work gets done in your community and where all community-based regulations are written and implemented. If a community is going to reduce or even stop negative impacts of development on their people, it's at the local level that meaningful and long-lasting legislation and programs must come into being. Those programs and that legislative process must be adaptive. However, because as the community grows, legislation must grow with it. The late Dennis Milletti reminds us that each community controls the character of its own disasters, that someone must take responsibility for the impacts for natural disasters and realize that the decisions that they, the community, are making today in terms of development, in terms of regulations, or in terms of lack of regulations, in terms of planning for the future, planning for climate change, just planning in general, will absolutely determine their future losses when it comes to the impacts of disasters. Many municipal attorneys are not experts in community liability or in takings issues. So the importance of how local governments can effectively deal with legal issues arising out of bad development decisions cannot be overstated. Local governments can and have been successfully sued because the decisions they made to allow development in at-risk for flood areas caused harm to other people. The days of sovereign immunity are all but gone. Negative impacts are a known quantity and become evident during the design phase of the development. They're easily accounted for. So if a community knowingly allows those adverse impacts by approving the development, then they, the community, can be brought into court and held accountable for their actions. Because with today's technology, impacts can be easily measured. NAI can change the whole dynamic of your community while still allowing for development, allowing good, sustainable, positive development. It promotes a green, more sustainable community in areas that need to be protected because of their environmental sensitivities, and it allows development where development should occur, and that's out of the areas prone to flooding, which also means out of the areas prone to flood damage. There are a whole host of benefits to implementing NAI, from improved water quality, where green corridors are established, less erosion and sedimentation issues, better bank stabilization, and that's just a few of the high points. And for those of you who are CRS communities, it has benefits with points that help with your CRS classification. So, like I said earlier, NAI is the flagship of ASFPM. It was developed by the organization to reduce flood losses nationwide. The original toolkit was developed in 2003, and then they came later on with the Coastal NAI Handbook in 2006. Recently, much more recently, we have developed a set of how-to guides. They're based on the 7 tools found in the toolkit, and they expound on the knowledge found in the toolkit. The 7 tools in the NAI toolkit include hazard identification and floodplain mapping, education and outreach, planning, regulations and development standards, mitigation, infrastructure, and emergency services. And like I said earlier, the how-to guides expound on each of those 7 tools. Users of the toolkit, or users of the how-to guides for that matter, should view NAI as a continuum. Every community is somewhere on the path between not addressing floodplain management standards at all, to addressing only the minimum requirements of the NFIP, or to being 100% resilient and sustainable in the face of a flood threat. There's not an AI set of standard rules or regulation. There's no template, because each community must adopt rules that are community-centric and good for them. So as I mentioned before, there are 7 tools in the toolkit. They are all strategies that can be used and activities that could be undertaken to incorporate NAI into the fabric of your community. And then those 7 tools are broken down into basic, better, and no adverse impact. Basic would be things like adopting the standards of the NFIP. Better would include things like having higher regulatory standards, such as free board. And then there's no adverse impact. If communities want to see results, especially long-lasting results, NAI principles are what is needed to effectively manage their flood risk in the community. Today, for expediency, we're just going to look at the planning tool from the toolkit. So basic strategies would include preparing a comprehensive land use plan and identifying flood and flood hazard areas in your comp plan, developing special subject plans such as a habitat protection plan or a watershed management plan, or adopting floodplain management principles into your zoning or other ordinances to get to required outcomes. Better strategies would be identifying high flood risk areas on land use maps, or restricting development in those same high risk flood areas, adopting low density zoning in or near floodplains, or making sure that flood is accounted for in your all hazards mitigation plan. So NAI strategies would include making sure that flood risk is accounted for in all of your planning processes, all the way through the community, and in all the goals and objectives that your community has. It would be rounding up allies to help you get your work done. And when I say get your work done, the work of reducing flood risk. It would be taking advantages of opportunities, for example, updating your plans, your map, your data after flood events. You need to ask yourself some questions both before and after a flood event. What areas need to be cleared and not redeveloped? What areas should be incorporated into retrofitting as part of reconstruction? What areas could be allowed to repair without any delays? And what changes need to be made to rebuilding and to building codes and the whole building process that would keep your community more resilient and more sustainable? What data do you have on hand right now that you could effectively use to plan with? Are you planning for today, or are you planning for tomorrow? Is your vision future oriented? Your best friend in the planning process is the public. Utilize them. They're a wealth of knowledge all on their own. What other outside agencies can you involve? Are they working on the same issues that you're working on? Can you work on solutions together? Do your solutions even make sense? Are your solutions doable with your budget, with your personnel? Nothing says you can't aim high, but be sure you evaluate your progress all along the way to make sure you're getting to where you want to go to. What is going on in your community that makes you know or suspect there are problems to be addressed? What are some of the key issues that people in the community can relate to? Like a main travel thoroughfare that floods every time it rains. Those issues are widely known by the community, and those are areas for potential flood impacts. Again, NAI is big picture thinking. NAI is also a win-win philosophy. It starts with the foundation that the primary driver is to enable better informed local decision-making about at-risk for flood development. It's not meant to paralyze development, and it's not meant to eliminate development. It's meant to take the risk caused from that development or the risk on that development into consideration when you make decisions. So I wanted to mention the ASFPM Foundation. They have been instrumental in helping us produce our how-to guides. And coming soon, sponsored in part by the ASFPM board and funded by ASFPM, will be an NAI legal issues guide. And we'll have that hopefully by the end of the year and available the 1st of 2022. And then while we're doing that, we're going to also update the NAI legal resources on the NAI website. So if you choose to look at the planning how-to guide, there are case studies. Here are 5 communities that have incorporated NAI strategies, and you can get examples of how you can incorporate NAI strategies into your community. And speaking of communities, here's a slide of things we have done here in Augusta, Georgia to make our community more resilient and more sustainable in the face of what was egregious flooding when I came here 23 years ago. So I'd like to leave you with a quote from what I consider to be the father of floodplain management, our friend in the business, Dr. Gilbert White. Flood losses are acts of nature, but floods are acts of nature, but flood losses are largely acts of men. It's something to think about as you listen to the other presenters today that will follow after I leave you. I hope that you have gotten some information about NAI from this presentation. If you need more information, I am always available. I've put my email address up on the screen, my mailing address, and I look for you to reach out to me and talk to me. Don't hesitate to contact me because I want to help your community to become more resilient, more sustainable. Are there any questions?
This is Ann Cass from San Juan, Texas. I'm with a small nonprofit that does self-help housing. Our problem here in Hidalgo County is we don't have FEMA maps that are current, and they won't be current until we fix the land side of the levees. So what do you do when you don't have FEMA maps to go by?
Well, Anne, I will tell you that for much of my tenure here in Augusta, Georgia, my FEMA maps were almost as old as I am, and that's pretty old. And I'm also land side of a levee, so I feel your pain. We went ahead and adopted higher regulatory standards on areas that we knew to flood, and adopted higher regulatory standards based on the flooding in those areas. For example, our community has a 3-foot freeboard requirement. We don't allow fill to be brought in to the floodplain with any development without the developer doing a no-rise certification. We've adopted a regulatory process where if you have more than 1 acre in the floodplain, you'll treat it like it's the floodway and you'll do a no-rise certification. And I have seen flooding reduced dramatically in the 23 years that I've been here, just using higher regulatory standards. And one of the neat things about it is through my membership with ASFPM, my involvement with No Adverse Impact, my involvement with people like the charm community and others in the floodplain management industry, people are always willing to help and to lend their expertise and lend their knowledge. You know, the folks of TFMA, they're in Texas. Find out what others are doing to make it work for them, see if it'll work for you, and then give it a try. If you have nothing and you're flooding, putting something at it, putting some regulation at it, is a way to try to address it until you get new maps. And I hope that's soon and not later, but because having been in that predicament for many, many years, it's hard to work with not knowing totally your flood hazard.
And Terry, this is Stephen Mikulencak. I do want to jump in just super quick here, and we're about to transition the follow-up. And I think Terry had some ideas about, what do we do when we don't have data. I do want to point out that we have FEMA Region 6 with us today. I'm not sure. I think Larry is here. Maybe give him a couple of moments this afternoon. He will definitely, he may be at some of our tables this afternoon. He should be able to speak to the status of data. So I'm not going to make any promises on their behalf, but they're definitely in a position to kind of know what that calendar might look like. So won't guarantee you'll like the answer, but at least we'll have more information. So
thank you, Steve.
Welcome.
Any other questions real quick
This is
before
Hudson.
switch over?
I have one more question.
Sure.
We can do that. Just in general, because nothing too specific, having you worked with the community on flooding, was it everyone on board all the time and it was a very easy process? Or were there, let's call it bumps in the road and getting everybody on the same page?
Well, it was lots of plates of cookies and lots of one-on-one visits. It was pretty easy to bring our engineering department on board. My biggest task was educating the elected officials, not that they weren't good people, but they needed to understand how we could balance development with the regulatory process and still have development and flood loss reduction. But once they were educated and once they understood that we could make an impact, a positive impact, I might say, with regulations and with looking at big picture, they came on board and have stayed on board. In fact, they have financed a buyout program for repetitively flooded homes in our area, and then that area becomes flood storage. So any of these ideas and strategies that I've shared with you both on the slides or very quickly in this Q&A, there's more. And so please reach out to me. I've left the slide up with my email address. Please reach out to me because I want to help. It takes us as a community of practitioners to get to the end result. And I had a lot of help along the way. Thank you, Hudson.
Thank you.
I have one more question. This is Augusta Sanchez with Cameron County. I hope it's just a quick question. When it comes to the not adverse impact, typically here in Cameron County, what developers do in some cases is that they have some detention requirements that we have in our rules. So what they do is they dig out the detention pond based on their calculations, and they use that that excavated material as fill to increase or to elevate the lowest grade of the homes. How does that play in the not adverse impact and on the floodplain management in general?
That's kind of a loaded question, Augustus, because it's different in every community. That might not work as well in a coastal community as it does in a riverine community. But I will tell you that here locally, that if they're balancing their site, so if they're not bringing in fill from off-site, but they're balancing their site with what they had on-site, it might be allowable, but we make them run the no-rise calculation to prove that they haven't caused adverse impacts. And so that has been my saving grace here locally, is that we make them not only do the engineering calculation, but run FEMA's HEC-RAS or HEC2 modeling program and prove to us that what they're doing make sure that there's not causing negative impacts either on their property or on adjoining property, because the FEMA modeling program looks it up and downstream. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
This is Tony Reisinger. I've got a question. I just got a notice in email on the HAZUS, H-A-Z-U-S, and how to quantify flood risk, an open source HAZUS walkthrough. And it's today from 2 to 3 p.m. Are y'all aware of that, or is that part of this?
No,
No,
I
that's-
was not aware of that, Tony. Maybe someone else could address that.
No, I was aware of that, Tony, but it's not part of this today, and I know they'll be recording that as well. So I did see that pop up on my screen too, but not part of what we're doing here today. But
Okay, thanks.
yeah, and sorry, I'm going to have to stop the questions there. If you do have more questions for Terri, please put them in the chat, and we can try to follow up on those afterwards. As Terri mentioned, she's very glad, and I know she's done this for the past, helping answer questions well after the workshops, and I'm certainly willing to do that too. So feel free to email me or Terri and let us know if you have any questions. And with that, I'm going to now switch over to Jerry Murphy, who's going to talk about kind of the legal foundation of NAI and to floodplain management. And Jerry is a faculty consultant at the University of Florida with the Program for Resource Efficient Communities. And Jerry is also a co-chair of our Higher Education Policy Committee with ASFPM. Jerry, please take it away.
There we go. I unmuted. Just a disclaimer real quick. They're testing fire alarms in my building, so there may be a little alarm to wake you up at some point. Good morning. I'm Jerry Murphy with the University of Florida Program for Resource Efficient Communities and Extension. I'm a faculty consultant, as Jeff mentioned, and at PREC, we regularly work with local governments to provide planning assistance to tackle challenges local governments face in the 21st century. These challenges increasingly include flooding and particularly climate change related impacts, including extreme weather, sunny day flooding, and sea level rise. Quick standard disclaimer, we're not practicing law here. The information presented is mine alone and are neither the opinions or positions of the Association of State Floodplain Managers or the University of Florida. And with that out of the way, so what keeps you up at night? As an appointed or elected official, building official, floodplain manager or planner, a regulatory taking, liability for enforcing your regulations, liability for not enforcing your regulations. Do you worry your standards aren't good enough to protect your community from the adverse impacts of flooding? Do citizens complain about flooding in areas where your current regulations are properly enforced? The key point of my presentation is that you're as likely to be sued for permitting risky development as you are for preventing it. Anybody can sue anybody in the United States, but you're your community's first and last line of defense against flood disasters. So the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, has four, I would say, aspects to it: flood insurance, floodplain regulations, risk mapping, and flood hazard mitigation. Depending on who you talk to, that's a 3- or 4-legged stool. I was in a conference call with several floodplain managers from different states working on converting our 273 educational materials onto an e-platform, and there was probably a 40-minute discussion about whether it was a 3-legged or 4-legged stool. But those are the 4 major components. But regardless of that, NFIP takes in far fewer dollars in premiums than it pays out in claims, which is not a sound business model. Because the NFIP is a federal program, it's up to Congress to make major modifications. And while congressional actions have been rare in the past, they have increasingly been moving in the direction of higher premiums, particularly for coastal properties. So in answer to the cartoon question, move to higher ground. First of all, don't build in the floodplain. but we do. As we do, and we should anticipate, expect, and prepare for flooding. And as extreme weather events increase with climate change, anticipate, expect, and prepare for more extreme flooding. Okay, take home lesson, floodplain equals flooding. More and more accurate flood data is available to local governments, and with more data, as Terri mentioned, comes responsibility, knowledge, and foreseeability. While the farmer's insurance perspective is novel, this is the photograph from Chicago area, and the case that is captioned at the top is Illinois Farmers Insurance Company versus Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. This is a good one to kick off our discussion of no adverse impacts in the law. Farmers Insurance sued the Water Reclamation District for Greater Chicago, Cook County, and the cities of Chicago and numerous other cities, towns, and villages in Illinois in a class action alleging that the municipalities, there's that bell, class action alleging that municipalities' failures to implement reasonable stormwater management practices and increase stormwater capacity resulted in increased payouts to the plaintiff's insured clients after heavy rains in April of 2013. The rains resulted in sewer water flooding of the insured's properties. Farmers Insurance alleged that the rainfall was within the anticipated 100-year rainfall return frequency, or alternatively, that it was within the climate change adjusted 100-year rainfall return frequency predicted by the 2008 Chicago Climate Action Plan. Farmers asserted claims of negligent maintenance liability, failure to remedy known dangerous conditions, those are allegations in common tort law, and takings without just compensation, which is federal and state constitutional challenges. Ultimately, the case was withdrawn. And when the case was withdrawn the following year, a farmers insurance spokesperson said, "We believe our lawsuit brought important issues to the attention of the respective cities and counties, and that our policyholders' interests will be protected by the local governments going forward." So let's look at a little overview and discuss the legal aspects of floodplain management and regulation, beginning with the common law. The majority of the United States have aspects of common law or judge-made law carried forward from England and the United Kingdom during the colonial era. Common law refers to the part of English law derived from custom and judicial precedent rather than statutes or laws. Contrasted with statutory law, the body of English law is adopted and modified separately by different states and the US and by the federal government. The development and widespread distribution of engineering handbooks and analytical tools by FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, engineering societies, and other agencies and groups are creating a national standard for reasonableness. For example, in Riedling v. City of Gainesville, the court held that the Department of Transportation's plans for a parkway were exempt from sovereign immunity protection. That's exempt from sovereign immunity protection, and consequently the DOT could be held liable for a nuisance due to the placement of fill and flooding. There was evidence that the plan or design for placement of fill was not prepared in substantial compliance with generally accepted engineering or design standards at the time such plan was prepared. More and more accurate flood data is available to local governments, as Terri mentioned, and with more data comes responsibility, knowledge, and foreseeability. While the farmers insurance perspective was novel from the standpoint of climate change, it was based on tried and true principles of community liability and took an interesting approach in defining the evolving standard of care. The Walkerton tragedy was a Canada-based problem around Ontario. Basically, the water supply became contaminated with E. coli. Thousands of people got ill. Several were treated. 7 died. And leading up to the tragedy, there were incidents of regulatory shortcomings, technological difficulties, insufficient training and knowledge, privatization of water testing, and budget cuts in the area of the environment. So this is a situation of negligence. The development and widespread distribution of engineering handbooks and analytical tools provides for reasonable anticipation that if you aren't looking at the most current data and analysis, you may not be doing what would be important, and you should be looking out that you might be causing a plan that would provide for nuisance damages. The most accurate climate projections and flood data is increasingly available to local governments, and with more data comes more knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about trespass, one of the other causes of action. Landowners can succeed in trespass suits against local government for certain types of public actions that result in a physical invasion of private property, including increased flooding or drainage. Then there's the law of surface water, and this goes back to the common enemy rule. The simplest version of the common enemy rule is that every landowner has the right to protect herself against surface water however she chooses. Therefore, no one has a right against other landowners, and no one is liable to anyone else for causing damage or alterations to the drainage of surface water. The common enemy rule says that protecting your own land. Some states apply the common enemy rule to surface water disputes. In most states, though, landowners cannot substantially damage other landowners. These are statutory changes to the common law, and they include the blocking of flow of water so that you can't reduce the amount of water that goes onto your neighbor's property, or increase that flow, or channel that flow to a point other than the point of natural discharge. And generally, landowners are liable for damages caused by their interference with the natural flow of surface water when their actions are unreasonable. Courts often find local governments liable for local government's actions, like inadequate construction or maintenance of public infrastructure, increasing flood damages on the property of another. Act of God or force majeure defenses are increasingly unsuccessful in court. Local government liability may be found where development permits issued in compliance with code standards result in adverse impacts. Prohibiting reasonable development may be found as a regulatory taking, and negotiating developments in the absence of code standards may be found to be arbitrary and capricious. So the NFIP requires the adoption of a minimum set of nationwide floodplain management criteria. Terry mentioned this. That's in order for the communities to be eligible for federally supported flood insurance, certain types of disaster assistance, and other federal support. Remember the old saw from advertising, your results may vary. Because in the absence of higher standards, flooding may still occur. Even with higher standards, flooding may occur, but the risk is less likely than with those higher standards. The minimum standards reduce overall flood damages for new construction and may be appropriate for managing the flood insurance fund, but FEMA has long supported the adoption of higher standards through programs such as the Community Rating System. So we've covered the torts aspect, and now we want to move into the constitutional challenges. Those are generally referred to as takings. And takings, as a colloquialism, is derived from a portion of the Bill of Rights' Fifth Amendment to the federal Constitution, often referred to as the Taking Clause, and/or state constitutional provisions or private property protection statutes that were so popular in the 1990s. These challenges are often raised by developers and private property owners when the regulating arms of local or state government indicate that a development or redevelopment proposal does not comply with the government's adopted land development regulatory scheme. And that's all to promote and protect the public health, safety, and welfare. So this is i.e. the police power. So a number of cases have come out of the Supreme Court, and they're noted over to the right in shorthand. But these are basically the ways to avoid a successful takings claim. Regulate to prevent harm. These are your purpose and intent statements, the recitals or whereas clauses in an ordinance. You want to make sure that you're always couching the regulation in the idea of protecting public health, safety, and welfare. You want to avoid an owner's right to exclude, so government shouldn't be interfering with private property, placing a telecommunications device on the wall without negotiating some sort of permission or exchange of value to do that. You want to avoid the denial of all economic uses, tell somebody that there's nothing at all that they can do on their property. Consider alternative development solutions like transferable development rights, similar residual rights and uses, and alternative development options to retain economic land value. That's the Penn Central case where the historic preservation community in New York City would not allow Penn Central Station to build up above the historic Penn Central Station. But instead, they provided them with the opportunity to transfer the height that they would normally be allowed, were it not historic, to another location and transfer that density. And at the most recent case, demonstrate a relationship between whatever the permit condition is and the harm that's to be avoided by the regulation. So in our legal research, we haven't found any cases where a landowner prevailed in a regulatory taking suit because of the community's denial to use the property where the proposal would have had a substantial offsite impact or threatened public safety. I mentioned very quickly about the Gove case. There, the court held that a zoning board's denial of a residential building permit for a parcel of land located within the Coastal Conservancy and Flood District was subject to severe coastal flooding, was not a taking because it did not deny the landowner all economically beneficial use of the land and did not deprive her of distinct investment-backed expectations. Another case to recall is McQueen v. South Carolina Coastal Council. There, the court held that a denial of permits to backfill 2 lots and build bulkheads for an area considered tidelands was not a taking because they were public trust property and subject to control by the state. In another case, Spiegel v. Beach Haven, the court held against facial challenge, building setbacks and fence ordinances for a coastal area which had been badly damaged by the Ash Wednesday storm of March 1962 were upheld against claims that the regulations were a taking of private property. Also, in McCarthy v. City of Manhattan Beach, the court upheld a beach zoning district which limited the beach to open space, recreational use based in part upon potential for storm damage to structures if constructed in the beach area. Some regulations about flash flood areas or cases about flash flood areas, Lindquist v. Omaha Realty. There, the court held that a resolution of Rapid City Council of June 1972 prohibiting issuance of building permits on one block after a devastating flood until a study was complete by the Planning Commission was a valid exercise of police powers and not a taking. So there they issued a moratorium because of a flooding situation and wouldn't allow construction until that study had been complete. Another Supreme Court case, First English, on remand from the Supreme Court to the California High Court, there the court held as a matter of law that the Los Angeles County's interim floodplain regulations for an area subject to severe flood and fire hazards was not a taking. And finally, in Turner v. County of Del Norte, the court upheld county floodplain zoning ordinance limiting areas subject to severe flooding to parks, recreation, and agricultural uses in an inverse condemnation action. So as Terry mentioned, NAI is a regulatory philosophy that looks to seek to mitigate adverse impacts through higher regulatory standards. The NIA approach is more comprehensive than the minimum NFIP regulations. It involves a greater citizen and professional-based participation in implementation. On a somewhat similar note to the Illinois court case in Beverly Bank v. Illinois Department of Transportation, the New Jersey Supreme Court in Usden v. Department of Environmental Protection upheld restrictive floodplain regulations for a commercial area because of the potential impact on employees and nearby citizens. There, the court observed, it seems clear that the DEP regulations are aimed to prevent injury during flooding to potential employees of the warehouse or materials that may be stored there, to other nearby citizens whose lives or property may be endangered by the stored items being swept along in a flood, and to the residents who might drink water polluted because of the stored items had entered an aqueduct or the aquifer. These restrictions are consistent with their stated purposes and are a reasonable means of attaining the goals the subject regulations, as applied to the facts of this case, have as their purpose the prevention of harm befalling other citizens. So the ASFPM no adverse impacts approach to floodplain management is an effective way to minimize community liability and withstand takings challenges. Local governments that prioritize an NAI approach to floodplain management and regulation, employing higher standards than the federal minimum NFIP standards, should also witness improved CRS scores, environmental conditions, and water quality. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And I didn't see any questions get put in during your presentations, but certainly there's time if right now, if somebody has any questions, please come off mute and go ahead and ask. Or if you want to type it in, I'm happy to read it too and ask it for you.
Well, Jerry, hearing none, thank you all very much. Just as a parting emphasis, health, safety, and welfare, whatever you're doing that's above the minimum standards, base it on good data and base it on protecting the health, safety, and welfare of your community. Thanks very much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jerry. And maybe as we just have a couple minutes before I'll transfer over to Thomas, is that ASFPM, with actually Jerry and Thomas's help, who you'll hear from next, we're putting together a legal guide for floodplain management, and that is in process. So probably end of this calendar year that will be available with all the resources that you're going to hear about today, plus a lot more that we know are going to be added to that. So look for that, and we'll definitely make sure that gets out there wide, and it is going to be addressed to attorneys and written for attorneys, but with narrative and inserts for floodplain managers to have that conversation with their attorneys. So with that, I'd like to introduce Thomas Ruppert with he's a coastal planning specialist at Florida Sea Grant, and is now going to be talking about kind of the coastal sea level rise adaptation and local government, and his title or presentation is titled "The Laws and Limits: Sea Level Rise Adaptation and Local Government." Thomas, looks like you're getting your screen up. I can see everything, so it's all yours, Thomas. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you, Jerry, for that presentation. And I think Jerry's presentation will really set the tone here and will help me kind of skip over a little bit of what I was going to do, because he gave you a good introduction to takings law and to tort law, which is one of the things I was going to attempt to do, but now we'll have a little more time for the policy responses. So here's just an overview, and I want to start with just how different our future is going to be. And when we look at how we've been planning and also how the law looks at planning and has been considering what local governments do in planning, it's been like we've actually been driving by looking in the rearview mirror, because what we look at for planning and what the law thinks about is we use past records of environmental conditions as our benchmark. And yet we know with climate change and sea level rise that the past data is no longer a good indicator of what we can expect in the future. So this whole idea of driving by looking in the rearview mirror works okay, maybe to some degree when you're on a straight road like this. But our road with the changes that we're seeing is a lot curvier now, and it doesn't work so well to drive looking in the rearview mirror anymore. We really need to consider the changing climate normals. We need to look at the heavier rainfall events and the increase in incidence of those events, more and longer droughts, and seas that are going to be rising for centuries at this point. So looking at all these really does mean we need to do something more than just look in the past. We have to look towards a changed future. And that includes not just floodplain managers, but the law that we depend upon to help you do your work needs to evolve as well. And of course, this comes in another context too, that you all operate in, which is that you're in local governments, and there are many different perspectives that local governments have, and sometimes they're conflicting. You do want to grow and increase your tax base, and you want to protect people and property. And sometimes those come into conflict, and you want to minimize your risk to public infrastructure and your liabilities for that infrastructure. And then you're also operating in the context of the short-term costs in politics of what you do versus kind of a longer term vision you might have and that safety and financial viability for your local government. So I was going to go into tort law just for a moment, but I think Jerry may have saved you from most of that. I just want to point out that for the most part, intentional torts are not our focus, though of course I now have to have a caveat because since Jerry mentioned trespass, yes, that is an intentional tort that can sometimes come into play, but primarily what we discuss is often negligence. And negligence means that you have some sort of duty to protect others, this duty of care, that you've somehow breached that duty. That breach of a duty has caused some sort of damages. And then there's this idea of sovereign immunity. And while I agree that sovereign immunity is decreasing, you know, it's still an issue and it drives some of the legal considerations. And then of course, takings, as Jerry pointed out, based on the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution, and the pertinent phrase from that is, here nor shall private property taken for public use without just compensation. And mostly what we focus on in floodplain management is regulatory takings. And that means we're not usually talking about eminent domain, because local governments and government at all levels does have the authority to take property as long as they are paying compensation for it. And that happens a lot for infrastructure work. So let's jump right into infrastructure and some of the issues here. So a colleague and I had put together an article addressing this quite some time ago here in Florida. And I will give the caveat this article and what I'm going to talk about is based specifically on Florida law. But at the same time, there are some pretty broad brush similarities across most states in the country. And I know you'll be getting a presentation here after me on the specifics of Texas law. So you can look forward to that hopefully being fleshed out and more specific to Texas. But in general, what's interesting is that local governments typically have no duty to provide drainage. Most local governments do provide some level of drainage services, but that's because they have the authority or power to do so, not a specific duty to do so. The interesting part, though, is since no good deed goes unpunished, once a local government does start to provide drainage services, they now have a duty to maintain those services reasonably. And if they fail in that duty, they can actually be liable under tort law. And while there's a duty to do proper maintenance or reasonable maintenance, there's no duty to upgrade existing services. And that is a big difference. And part of the reason for that is if you've already got infrastructure in place, people are probably dependent upon that to protect them. And yet people don't necessarily have a right to depend on an infrastructure that hasn't been built. There's also an interesting reason for separation, reason that we make this distinction based on separation of government powers, now coming a little bit later. And also just need to preserve the discretionary powers of the legislative branch, which would be the local government councils and commissions that need to make decisions about how and where they spend their limited funds on infrastructure development. So let's jump back a little bit to this idea of maintenance versus an upgrade. As I said, there is liability if you don't do proper maintenance, but there is no liability if you choose not to upgrade. And there is sovereign immunity in many instances for planning, as I think Jerry and maybe also Terri pointed out. The limitation on that immunity is that if you plan very poorly and the planning itself is negligent in its execution, then you may still be liable. But typically, if your planning is based on good information and data and done well, if you decide not to do something, that typically is going to be, you're going to enjoy sovereign immunity for that. But again, as Jerry pointed out, don't assume that anything you make as a planning decision is going to automatically be immune. But of course, there is no immunity for what we call operations or ministerial or non-discretionary duties. Government always in operations has a duty to the public to act with reasonable care to avoid harm, as do we all in our lives. And so there's typically not immunity. Again, that's this distinction between maintenance versus upgrade. So of course, with climate change and sea level rise impacting infrastructure, then the multi-billion-dollar question becomes, well, what does it mean for sea level rise or heavier rainfall events to occur and overwhelm infrastructure? Does that mean that was a lack of planning, or was that a lack of maintenance when that infrastructure no longer serves to provide the same services it once did? And my colleague and I concluded in our analysis of the Florida law that most likely it should be concluded that if sea level rise is making drainage systems no longer function properly, as long as the local government could demonstrate that they've adequately maintained that system and that the reason for the failure is due to a rising sea, that most likely they would probably enjoy immunity for not having upgraded that system. But again, until a court of law, that is something that's going to have to be ruled on in the context of litigation through the courts, I believe. So here are just a couple of citations noting that, again, that local government does typically have immunity from damages that occur as a result of a local government's policy decision. But at the same time, there is potential liability if you don't do proper maintenance. Now in the road context, I want to talk just for a few minutes about an important case that really has gotten a lot of attention around the country. What's interesting is this case along the coast in Northeast Florida never mentions sea level rise, but of course it is all about one of the impacts of sea level rise that is exacerbated, which is coastal erosion and flooding. So here what you see is what used to be Florida State Highway A1A. And if you look in the foreground in between the two signs to the right, you can see some black spots in the sand. That's the last remnants of the last bit of pavement of this road that washed out after a storm. And the homeowners along here, after several decades of struggling with this road washing out, which had been occurring, of course, prior to the construction of most of these homes, they were unhappy with their lack of access to their homes because they no longer had a nice paved road. So they sued the county. And let's just, before we get into the lawsuit, just give you a little flavor for what this area looks like. So here is one of the many homes along this segment of what used to be road. And here you can see in the foreground some of the decommissioned water supply infrastructure. None of the homes along there currently have any publicly available water supply anymore. But note that that water supply was under what used to be the road. So here, between that house and that pipe is where the road used to be. Here's that same home after Hurricane Matthew in 2016. And the previous picture, let's go back. I took this in, I believe, 2013 or 14. So you can see the change. There's no longer any discernible dune left in front of this house to protect it. And here is that same house 1 year later after Hurricane Irma. So this is an extremely dynamic, vulnerable area. It's basically just a spit of sand in between the Atlantic Ocean and a river. So very challenging place. So to give you just another bit of history, this A1A had actually been a road that was built in this area back in the 1950s by the Florida Department of Transportation. And within a decade of building that road, the Florida DOT decided it was not smart to build it on this little spit of sand in between the Atlantic Ocean and a river where there was a lot of erosion occurring. So they actually relocated 1.6 miles of that road further inland. Then DOT held on to that bit of right of way for a number of years, and there were very, very few homes, I think 3 homes on the stretch of road at that point. But then in 1979, DOT went to St. Johns County and said, hey, St. Johns County, would you like to have this 1.6 miles? And the county commission made what was their first and probably biggest mistake, which was they accepted that piece of roadway from the Department of Transportation in 1979. By 1980, the county continued to make mistakes by then issuing permits for numerous new homes along this segment of road that, of course, the DOT had already given up on. It's something they didn't even want to try to maintain or keep in existence. So, but of course, the homeowners built numerous additional homes on there, and by the time I went to the lawsuit, there were over 24 homes, properties built along this piece of road. So the property owners claimed that it was a taking of their private property rights because the county was not doing enough to maintain the road. And they said that the county had a duty to maintain it. And at the trial court, the county said, look, we've spent over 25 times as much money calculated on a per mile per year basis trying to do maintenance on this road as we do on our standard county roads. It's not possible. They also adduced evidence in the trial court that it would have cost far more than their entire annual road and maintenance budget for over 1,000 miles of road just to try to do a beach nourishment project that would have created enough dry land to even attempt to put a road back in this 1.6 mile segment. So just ridiculous sums of money that were taken to try to do anything substantial here. And again, here you can see this picture is actually about 2013 prior to much more extensive erosion damage. And you can see at this point, there were still some power lines there that provide electricity to these homes. Those are all now gone, and these homes have neither public water nor public electrical service. And yet, after the storms, most recent storms, these homes are now being fixed up again and being lived in with their own solar panels and their own wells. And think about their waste system. I didn't show the pictures where you can see the washed away drain lines and the exposed septic tanks from these storms. But anyway, the trial court agreed with the county that yes, the county didn't need to spend, had the discretion not to spend those kinds of sums of money just for this small segment of a road. And they approved the county's motion to dismiss that lawsuit. The property owners, of course, unhappy with this. They appealed, and at the 5th District Court of Appeal, the court had a little different take on it. They said, yes, county, you do have a lot of discretion in how you spend your road maintenance funds, but that is not absolute discretion. And that court made up some new law here in the state of Florida, which says that you must provide a reasonable level of maintenance that results in meaningful access. Well, yes, the reasonable level of maintenance sounds okay under tort law, but having to result in meaningful access, I think that poses a real challenge for the county in the situation that you can see right here before your eyes. But I think what this really does is it really points out the critical role that capital improvements planning plays, because in that case, I think what the 5th District Court of Appeals really failed to understand or respect sufficiently is that the county was in an extremely difficult position because, again, there really wasn't much way to provide a lot of access there beyond just leaving it sand because of the extreme cost of trying to do so. And so that when the local government is making that kind of legislative or balancing choice between very difficult options, that is really the heart of what legislative duty they have versus the judicial duty of the court to interpret what the law is. So I think what you really see is that's when we come back to this idea of separation of powers. The courts are supposed to respect that there are policy decisions that are the real domain of legislators, which means the local government commissions and councils, not the court system. And I think capital improvement planning is one of the most clear representations of the legislative duty of local governments, because it really is all about the local government's discretion and about making these choices when you have to balance really challenging situations and policy considerations. So I think making sure that you've got a very careful plan for how to do this capital improvement planning is critical to the defensibility of your longer term actions to avoid liability, financial or legal, for infrastructure decisions. And so I think integrating limits on infrastructure expansion or rebuild and design and creating more clarity on just how you interpret the ministerial maintenance activities versus your discretionary planning and legislative actions in capital improvement planning can really be a great asset to a local government in defending against potential legal cases. Just some supporting articles and resources for you there. And then before we move on to some of the policy options, I want to bring up one other consideration that hasn't often gotten much airtime yet, I think, which is what will become of our beaches as sea levels continue to rise. Here are some additional photos from along that same roadway at different points in time. And what you can see is as we get increased inundation, increased erosion, that you are going, and expansion of floodplains, you're going to see more and more damage and destruction. And as that happens, how, when will that get cleaned up? Who pays for that? At some point, properties will likely be abandoned because at some point there's just not enough value left in that property to try to justify doing anything. This house, by the way, is finally washed away, but it's pretty iconic out there. And this was up in Chesapeake Bay. So as this occurs, you know, we've joked in the past about, well, you know, as one waterfront property washes away, the next line becomes more valuable because now it's the new waterfront property. But really, who wants the new waterfront property if we don't clean up what was there before? And you can see the severity of vacated and abandoned properties when you look at the situation that Detroit has confronted for years in trying to deal with. When abandoned and vacated properties become pervasive, they dramatically drive down property values. They're a mess. You end up with squatters and illegal activities. And in the coastal context, you'll see pretty serious pollution by the remnants of what was left. So one of the things that I've floated as a potential idea is assessing those properties in anticipation of their eventual potential abandonment, and assessing them to create a fund that would clean them up on their own. Because if you look at the way local governments usually operate to clean up properties that violate code, their code of ordinances for property conditions, they usually operate on the idea of the local government will come in and do it if do the cleanup if the property owner doesn't, and then the local government will recoup its cost by a tax lien on that property leading to a sale of the property. But in these cases, you're looking at properties where their value has disappeared. And so you really can't recoup with your local government any cost that you put in to clean them up. So now let's get on to some of the other policy responses for trying to deal with these issues, particularly in the coastal area, but also some of these are quite relevant to floodplains generally. So I started off with kind of some of the safest policy response, and I call them safest because these are the least likely to result in a successful legal claim, whether it be tort or takings against a local government. I want to preface this with the idea that local governments are not going to, you cannot as a local government really seek to realistically avoid any potential lawsuits. That's just not, lawsuits are going to happen, particularly as we see local governments pushed up against a wall as climate change impacts and civil rights impacts really eat away at the level of infrastructure services they've historically provided. You will at some point probably get sued. So the safest policy, even the safest policy responses aren't necessarily about completely avoiding potential liability. It's about decreasing your long-term largest liabilities. And also keep in mind that just because you're sued doesn't mean you're going to lose. So some of the safest policy responses. I think communicating to the public and to property owners that there is a changing future coming their way and providing notice or disclosures to those in at-risk areas is absolutely critical, because part of takings law, part of this regulatory takings that people often sue under, part of that is what we call reasonable investment-backed expectations. What it's reasonable for a property owner to expect helps a court decide whether or not they think liability is appropriate. And if you're providing notice, that really helps you in a court tell the court, look, it's not reasonable for them to think that they weren't going to suffer flooding in this situation, because we've been telling them for years, here are the maps, here are the likelihoods of flooding. So that's not a reasonable thing to base liability. You can increase design standards. In other words, the increased elevation for new buildings that might be in the floodplain. I think it might have been Terri earlier that mentioned they have a 3-foot freeboard requirement above base flood elevation. Those are really great things, and those are going to survive challenge. The capital improvements plan that I just mentioned, make sure you clearly integrate into your capital improvement planning for the future impacts of climate change and sea level rise, and note that you're probably going to be experiencing decreased tax revenue as properties lose value or even fully disappear from the tax rolls. You can model good behavior by ensuring that all your public building siting and design clearly accounts for climate change and sea level rise impacts through good data and analysis. And finally, there's the potential option in some cases for purchase of at-risk properties, either purchasing them outright or purchasing some sort of easement to prevent development. Then there are some policies that might expose you to a slightly increased risk of takings or tort liability. You could set up increased buffers or setbacks, prohibition on government financed structures and armoring in areas subject to sea level rise or increased flooding, and large scale public land acquisitions, and then turn around and take those properties that you purchased and either rent or lease them back with restrictions. And that way what you can do is take the rental income to offset some of the cost of purchasing. Oops, my apologies. And finally, some zoning. A number of different zoning tools, overlays, transfer developments rights, elevation, down zoning, non-conforming use policies. Again, while I call these moderate risk, there might be an increased risk of lawsuit, but again, you're not necessarily going to lose that done properly. And as Jerry emphasized, health, safety, and welfare. Base it on those, and you're much more likely to survive any sort of lawsuit without liability. And finally, some of the riskiest policies. These are the highest risk of provoking a lawsuit, but I think they're also very necessary, because as the old adage goes, when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. And I would argue here's a nice example of a local government where they're still furiously digging when they permit buildings like this. And so you're talking about potential for severe restrictions on development or redevelopment in the most at-risk areas. If you've got the data and analysis demonstrating that development or redevelopment areas is going to be at extreme risk of flooding or other hazards, that might still be a good time to say, we're going to take that step. And also you can start looking at where you do allow development, the potential for exactions. Exactions means that you tell a property owner, yes, we may permit this, but here is what we want from you to do it. In the last few years, some very difficult case laws emanated from the United States Supreme Court that makes this much, much more difficult. So ironically, property rights protection actually made it more difficult for government to consider this option of exactions, which I would argue is a bad precedent because allowing local governments to use the process of exactions can actually increase what you might be willing to allow property owners to do, but that tool has become more and more difficult to use. And finally, I think it's worth just considering what are some of the drivers and impediments of trying to implement better policy. I think it's not a lack of tools. I think what really happens is there are a number of impediments that have stopped us from doing better management in the past. And for those that want to understand this, I think it's great to read a very, very short little book called The Ostrich Paradox. It's written by, I believe, an economist and a psychologist. They work up at the University of Pennsylvania, and they categorize and list and give examples in the disaster management, disaster planning area about myopia, amnesia, optimism, inertia, simplification, and herding that really prevent us from doing better. And of course, at the local level, you've always got politics. People are subject to the idea of a limited pool of worry, or the fact that we just can't worry about everything all the time. And at the local government, you're also really subject to a need of immediacy. In other words, there are always fires to put out at the local government level, and long-term planning is seldom a fire that needs to be put out. And at the last point, that community engagement is key to building any support for more progressive, longer-term action on these issues. And what presentation is complete without at least some sort of humor? So with that, I would just say thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for Texas A&M and ASFPM for putting this program together.
Thank you, Thomas. I did not see any questions in the chat yet, but certainly there's time if somebody wants to ask, come off mute and ask in person.
Yeah, this is Hudson. I got more of a comment maybe in that.
Sure.
Based on what you have told us and what needs to be done, we should have started all this 100 years ago.
Yes, that would have been preferable, Hudson. If we could rewind the clock, that would be wonderful. But how does that go? The best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. The second best time is today.
And the follow-up is, again, based on what you tell me, is public education is probably the single biggest thing that needs to happen first.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that, because what you see is without that level of public education, people don't understand just how important it is for this planning at the local government level to be in place. It might be portrayed to them as, oh, heavy-handed local government regulation or restrictions, when it can be portrayed that way, but it really actually needs to be portrayed as, this is how government helps you understand the risks so that you don't put yourself and the rest of your community at danger of physical harm or of financial instability because the local, state, or federal government is bailing everybody out because they built in these terrible places. I mean, if we look at the aftermath of these disasters, How did they happen? They happened because local governments permitted. And we need to put that frame out there and get the public to understand that that is the reason for trying to change how we manage our floodplains. It's not about controlling individuals per se. It's about minimizing the harm to individual property owners and our communities and our nation as a whole. I think that cannot be overstated, because if we don't take control of the frame of how people understand this, they're not going to support it. And I don't care how much it's legal to do something, don't have public support, it's difficult at the local level to make it happen.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, Thomas. This is Augusto Sanchez with Cameron County. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. Here in Cameron County in South Padre Island, we have South Padre Island is a barrier island, which is really just a higher sandbar in the Gulf, and it's eroding, especially in the north end, which is unincorporated. And that main road that belongs to the Texas DOT, I mean, it's getting close. Well, the ocean is getting closer and closer every year. And as of last year, I think the average erosion rate was just doubled just last year due to the whole activity that we had in the Gulf. So right now I can see that, I mean, that particular risk for the county of the state saying, hey, here's your easement, you want to take on it. And so one of the takeaways from your presentation is just don't take ownership of the right of way or the road per se. But I mean, beyond just the county washing their hands and just being legally safe, I mean, what would be the best for the community, or what would be the best actions to, for the well-being of the community in general? Because right now, I mean, South Padre Island is a very narrow strip of land, but it carries, I mean, the South Padre Island and the Port of Brownsville, I mean, they carry 40% of the appraised value of the county, which is pretty significant to, the tax revenues for us. So, I mean, it is imperative, and it behooves to us to just take care of that in the best way possible. So, I mean, what's your take on that? I just don't want to wash the county's hands and just be legally safe and then forget about the rest.
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. It's been a lot of years since I've had the pleasure of visiting South Padre Island, but I do recall going there and seeing some of the erosion even a number of years ago. And I don't have any simple answers for you, because I don't think there are any simple answers. I do strenuously advise local governments against accepting any dedications to the local government of existing infrastructure. And some policies recently adopted by a local government here in Florida that I had presented to them. It specifically notes that the only time that the county that the city in this case would even consider accepting any sort of infrastructure dedication was if the dedicator could demonstrate that the infrastructure as built conforms with current standards that would be required by the city for construction of its own infrastructure. I understand that, as with many coastal communities, those very narrow strips of land are incredibly high value. At the same time, I think accepting that infrastructure and getting yourself into the hot water, then being responsible for it, still might outweigh what you independently can do. I think in your case, potentially one way to go might be to try to work with your DOT and their work on the road. You have a great interest in that. It might still be worth investing some of your money in order to try to protect some of your taxable value and tax receipts in that area by keeping that road there, and try to encourage DOT to collaborate with you and come up with some innovative design. And I think that is probably one of the few things that really occurs to me as a potential option for you. But ultimately, some of these places, we really also need to be just thinking longer term. Things are not going to stay the same. And low-lying barrier islands, in many cases, like the community I referenced that no longer will accept most medications, they are now starting to plan with an eye to the long term, that they understand that they are going to shrink first, and then they are going to disappear. They know this. And that is a really sea change in mentality for local governments, because we're typically accustomed to this idea that local governments grow. That's, any healthy local government is growing. If you're not growing, you're not a healthy local government. And that mentality needs to change. And I've, in other contexts, said, I think, our human life is kind of a better analogy. We don't grow and live forever. We know that we pass through childhood, teenage, young adult, middle age, and old age, and then eventually we pass on. And yet we're not paralyzed every moment that, oh my gosh, I won't be here forever, and I'm not going to get any younger. No, we still plan for the future, maybe tomorrow, next week, next month. Some people even plan for retirement. We just need a different mentality of maximizing our quality of life in the time that we have and trying to be realistic about that time and make the best use of what we can. And I think that is a really hard sell, but it's really a fundamental mental change that we need to undertake at the local government level with areas that we just simply cannot. I don't think we're gonna have the resources to change the long-term outlook in a safe manner.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you. I might be bugging you later down the road.
I welcome that. You have my
questions.
contact information here, right here.
Thank you.
Augusta, thank you for the question, and Thomas, thank you for the presentation. We are certainly, if there's more questions, put them in the chat or send them again to Thomas or to I. We'll make sure we'll try to get those answered for you. We are moving into a break, so you can get up, walk around in case you haven't been. That's kind of the nice thing about a virtual workshop. Sometimes you can just do those things, but we want you to definitely come back after the break. Larry Dunbar is going to be talking, and he's a practicing engineer and attorney in Texas, so he's going to be talking more specifically about some of the Texas law in that case. So please join us right after the break, and we will try to get started right at the top of the hour. So thanks again, Thomas, and we will talk to everybody in a few more minutes.
Thank you, my pleasure.
That's right. Like I said, I'm gonna kind of give them a few of the basics.
Yep.
As it pertains to Texas law specifically, and then kind of just see where it goes from there.
Someone also asked a question early on about the IBWC
Yeah.
along the border, and that's probably a pretty unique situation down here in the valley.
Yeah, and it looked like Larry Voice from FEMA Region 6 tried to answer that in the chat. It sounded like FEMA was coming up with some additional or new mapping in that area.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure what his answer was to, because someone had asked about the HAZUS thing right before that. So
Yeah.
I guess it could apply to both questions.
Yeah, this is Larry Voice. If you want a little bit of clarification on that, yeah, we are developing base level engineering for the South Laguna Madre HUC 8, which the HUC 8's a USGS classification division of the watersheds.
Right.
So it includes all of Cameron. It includes probably 80 to 90% of Hidalgo. Doesn't get the very western edge. Gets most of Willacy County, and it's non-regulatory. It's really a starting point. It's going to give you good data in the urban areas where there's not a lot of structures impacting flow, but it needs to be refined. And really, it's IBWC is working towards completing their work on the levees. We're looking at at that next step. Once they're done, then we need to look at updating the data there. And this base level engineering will be really good data in some areas. In other areas, it'll be maybe a starting point that that, you know, communities and or FEMA and or the Texas Water Development Board, who are in close partnership with us on these base level engineering projects, we'll just have to look at how it needs to be updated in some of these other areas. So we encourage you to go to that website. You can see what's available for the areas where we have base level engineering. It's something we're excited about. It's something that Texas Water Development Board is excited about, and they're developing as much as we are right now with the base level engineering. So,
Hey, Larry, this is Larry Dunbar. Quick question on that. With that kind of quote unquote updated or better, you know, engineering analyses, can the community adopt those as best available information for use in enforcing their floodplain regulations?
they can, where, you know, you got to remember that from a NFIP standpoint, you've got to meet the minimum requirements, which is enforcing your flood insurance rate map. So where those requirements are more restrictive,
right,
you can certainly use them. Where they're less restrictive, you need to use the flood insurance rate map. Now, another thing that can be done, for example, you can review these, and you know, if you think that in the you know, one of the issues with a lot of the areas on these maps, especially in the undeveloped areas, is you have zone A's with no base flood elevations.
Right.
So you can look and, hey, you know, if you think these look pretty reasonable in these areas, adopt these elevations, and that gives you something that you can tell people to build to in these zone A areas. And incidentally, we do in the zone A areas allow surveyors to use these as well, I hate using the term base flood elevations because that has regulatory implications, but they can be used for letter of map amendments, and we have issued letter of map amendments where this data has been used. So they certainly can be used where they're more restrictive, but remember, you've gotta enforce that,
right,
that firm as a minimum standard.
Right. Yeah, it ends up being almost, you have two sets of standards and you have to meet the stricter of the two.
Yeah. And you know, one of the things we're really excited about in this area, now, first of all, we still have some of the levee issues to figure out, but it's also we're using 2D modeling. That's a really flat area, lots of overland flow. This is gonna be you know, not only is our current data old there, but this is also gonna be a significant technological improvement between the LiDAR data, topographic data, and this 2D modeling. So we're really looking forward to having this complete. And we actually provided some draft data for Willacy, and somehow or other, this is probably, I apologize, this is probably me missing something somewhere along the line. I didn't realize that Hidalgo and Cameron were going to be involved too, although I will be honest, there's more issues to look at in the review process in Hidalgo and in Cameron than in Willacy. And so the contractor may have been a little more hesitant about sharing that data when it's still in draft format anyways. But for those, for people in, you know, at one of for the CHARM exercise, people with looking at Willacy, that will be one of the data sets that's available, which there we have even worse data than Hidalgo because 3/4 of the data isn't even printed on the map. We just wave our hands and say, okay, it's not printed, so it's zone X. And here they're actually getting some data that will provide them with some good information.
Well, thank you both. And Larry Boyce, please stay on. I mean, we're gonna, as if other questions come up, and certainly as we go through the CHARM exercise and learning more about the base level engineering data, I think it would be great for this audience and for this crew. So I look forward to hearing more about it as well.
And I will be honest with you, I've got a couple other meetings that I've kind of been multitasking, so I should probably not receive credit for this.
No,
and I've got other sources where I end up with plenty of credits at the end of the year anyway. So just as a fair notice, don't award me any hours towards CFM recertification, because I am at times multitasking.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're going to get started again, and as I mentioned before we went into the break, that Larry Dunbar is going to be talking about flooding, property rights, and drainage, and this will probably be a bit more of a discussion per Larry's thoughts. So Larry, I'm just going to turn it over to you to kick this off, and thank you for joining us, and it's all yours, Larry.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Okay, earlier today you've heard from some lawyers about kind of some of the legal aspects associated with no adverse impact and floodplain regulations, et cetera. And I'm going to kind of zero in on some of the Texas laws that pertain to this, particularly with regards to kind of property rights and drainage law in Texas. I'll make my presentation kind of hopefully, you know, about half the time, and the rest of the time I'll open it up for specific questions, because this subject matter is so broad. I'm not sure what you all want to really hear. So let me start by just kind of giving you an overview of what this is going to look like. Okay. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Texas water law versus Texas drainage law, because they kind of relate to one another, and I'll show you shortly how that happens. And it kind of also involves like who owns the water, and if the state owns the water, certain laws apply, and if the landowner owns the water, other laws apply or were created for them. And so it then becomes a question of, you know, whether you can divert or impound or use the water will maybe depend upon who owns it. And that kind of gets into understanding, therefore, what laws pertain to drainage water, storm water, surface runoff water, versus laws that may relate to floodwaters or waters in the stream associated with state water. And then I'll talk a little about how, you know, regulating land use and how that may affect flooding and drainage matters, and then we can go into questions. So under Texas water law, it's really focused on, and the Texas water law is pretty much covered within the Texas Water Code. The laws of the state of Texas that are under that particular codification of the law, and it's called the Texas Water Code. And it really deals more with who owns the water and how that water can be used. And of course, it's primarily dealing with state water. You know, the water that's owned by the state of Texas, they tend to dictate how that water can be used, diverted, impounded, et cetera. Texas drainage law is more focused on what one can or cannot do in altering the flow of water. Obviously, you know, going across one's land. And so you get into the issue of, you know, you have a typical water course, which is that kind of blue line going through a drainage area. The black lines are showing the direction of the water. That red box is, let's say, a typical property owner's property. And so you have water, obviously, that falls on your tract of land that's going to run along the surface of the land headed towards the water course, and then goes off your property. You also have water that comes from upstream or uphill flowing onto your land, and therefore also headed towards the water course. And then, of course, in this particular situation, you have a water course that's bringing water in a water course, stream, creek, etc., through your land and then onward. And Texas water law is trying to provide rules and regulation as to who owns all that water. Texas drainage law, again, is looking at, okay, understanding who owns what water. How could one maybe build dams or barriers shown in yellow to divert, impound, or otherwise might use that water, how can that be done? So in terms of who owns the water, the state says essentially under statute section 11021 in the Texas Water Code, the state basically says, if you read the statute closely, they own everything. The water of the ordinary flow, the underflow, the tides of every flowing river, stream, lake, every bay and arm of the Gulf, and the stormwater, floodwater, and rainwater of every river, natural stream, canyon, ravine, depression, and watershed in the state is the property of the state. So when you read that, it sure sounds like the state owns all the water that's on the surface in every watershed. Well, that's not exactly true. Case law and Texas courts have recognized that, no, wait a second, a landowner actually owns water that flows across the surface of his land before it gets into a water course. But once it gets into a water course, it becomes, quote, owned by the state of Texas. So that becomes an issue in understanding who owns what, because a landowner can use his own water without permission from the state, but if it's state water, then he needs to get permission generally. So the Texas Administrative Code, TAC, has some definitions in it, and their definition of state water is very similar to what we just read, except it doesn't include that watershed provision. So it says the water of the ordinary flow, underflow, and tides of every flowing stream, river, lake, blah, 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 and the stormwater, floodwater, and rainwater of every river, natural stream, and water course in the state. So they took out some of those other provisions because that stormwater and rainwater that before it gets into a water course is not owned by the state. It's owned by the landowner. And you can see down there at the bottom of those definitions, diffused surface water, number 17, water on the surface of the land in places other than water courses. And what they're getting at there is that's diffused surface water. That's, quote unquote, the water owned by the landowner versus, I guess, other surface water that's not diffused, that's generally owned by the state of Texas. So because of that, then when you get to the question of, okay, as a landowner, can I divert, impound, or use that water, and how can I do it? Well, if it's state water, you're going to need a permit from the state of Texas, unless you fall under one of the exemptions, which we'll look at shortly. So, for example, if I want to put a dam like that yellow mark on my property that cuts across that water course, I'm going to need a permit from the state of Texas to do that, unless that particular size of dam or how I'm going to use it may be exempt from having to get a permit from the state of Texas. Where as a landowner, I can put dams up and block or capture diffuse surface water that's on my land, because that's my water. And probably the only restriction to that is when I do that, I just can't harm my neighbor. I can't harm properties outside of my own property in doing something like that. For example, if I put a barrier up and divert the water trying to come on my land and I send it somewhere else, I may be damaging that particular, adjacent property owner. Or if I put a dam up and backwater up, do I backwater up so far that it actually goes off my property onto someone else's property? Again, possibly damaging that neighbor's property, which is illegal. And there is a particular provision in the Texas Water Code under section 11.086 of the Texas Water Code that specifically deals with this issue of a landowner doing something on his own property. And so you read this provision and it says under 11.086A at the top, says no person may divert or impound the natural flow of surface waters in this state or permit a diversion or impounding by him to continue in a manner that damages the property of another by the overflow of the water diverted or impounded. So when many lawyers first read that, they think, oh, okay, so natural flow of surface waters in this state, that must include both this diffuse surface water as well as water in watercourses. Unfortunately, it does not include that. The courts have interpreted this statute when it says the natural flow of surface waters. When they say surface waters in this statute, they are referring to diffused surface waters, contrary to other surface water that would be probably waters owned by the state of Texas. And this is where the Texas water law and Texas drainage law kind of get some interplay in terms of who owns the water has a lot to do therefore with what you can do with it. And here's a statute that specifically only pertains to the natural flow of diffuse surface waters. And natural flow, what does that mean? Well, that means it's probably the flow of the natural ground before it's been maybe altered by man. And if man's already altered the flow of the diffuse surface water, well, then it's not natural anymore. And so this statute wouldn't apply. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this statute is what's called a strict liability statute. So you heard the other lawyers talk about, the typical causes of action that a lawyer brings against a defendant for flooding or drainage type matters is typically negligence, nuisance, trespass. If it's a government entity, they'll bring a takings claim. As a lawyer, I've done that very often. But this particular statute, as a strict liability statute, you don't have to show that the defendant did it unreasonably or he was negligent. He could have done everything right, but if he diverted or impounded, quote, the natural flow of this diffuse surface water in a manner that damages the property of another by the overflow of the water, he's liable for the damages. Doesn't matter if he was negligent or not, makes no difference. So this is a pretty powerful statute if you can fit into all the categories that apply for this particular statute. And then under C, though, it says this prohibition under Section A does not in any way affect construction and maintenance of levees and other improvements to control floods, etc., in rivers, creeks, and streams. Kind of saying this statute really doesn't apply to doing those kind of things in these water courses. Okay, well, that's great. So what happens in those situations? Well, remember, if it's water in the rivers, streams, or creeks, and they're in a water course, it's state water. And so there's another section of the water code, section 16.236, that talks about no person may construct or cause be constructed, maintained, or cause be maintained any levee or other such improvement on, along, or near any stream of this state, subject to floods and overflows, without first getting approval of the plans from the Texas TCQ, or Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So this statute applies to basically dealing with altering state water flow that other statute applies to altering landowner water flow. And of course, this section has a bunch of exemptions to it. And a lot of the exemptions deal with improvements that are maybe in a city or a town or within the boundaries of political subdivision, if they're under the National Flood Insurance Program, believing that, well, if a community, city or county has National Flood Insurance Program rules and regulations, then the state will defer to that political subdivision to provide the approval of the plans for construction or maintenance of this kind of particular type of dam or other improvement across a water course, to provide the necessary approvals and make sure presumably it's not causing any adverse impacts. Then there's also, under this exemption, there's an exemption for dams authorized by section 11.142 of the Water Code. Okay, well, there's section 11.142 of the Texas Water Code involving exemptions to having to get a permit. And here, if you're going to build a dam across a water course, i.e. blocking or diverting or impounding state water, normally you need a permit, but you can do it without a permit if you're only going to temporarily store or basically store 200 acre feet of water or less for domestic and livestock purposes. So the state is basically saying, yeah, that's our water, but we'll let you basically capture it and use it for certain purposes without having to get a permit for us. And so A deals with domestic and livestock purposes, section B deals with for fish and wildlife purposes. There's another B for commercial and non-commercial wildlife management, including fishing. So you have these various exceptions. So there's a whole big book on all these laws and regulations regarding using state water. Then we get to regulating land use. And there's a section 16.315 of the Texas Water Code about giving political subdivisions the power to an authorization to take all necessary and reasonable steps to implement requirements and criteria of the National Flood Insurance Program and stricter requirements, not less stringent requirements, but stricter requirements than the National Flood Insurance Program if they so choose. So many communities, especially in developing communities, need to adopt basically development guidelines and development criteria to control development, not only to protect the development itself, but to protect folks downstream. And that's where the no adverse impact concept comes about. That's a whole complicated process of, as you've heard, getting the maps to know where the existing flood risk is, and then developing criteria for new development to make sure that flood risk is not increased. And we, in developing areas where I'm from, which is kind of the Houston area, we deal with those issues all the time. I'm a consultant to the Fort Bend County Drainage District, which is a county right next to Harris County. And it's half developed and the other half's undeveloped, but it's probably going to be developing. And so that particular drainage district is in a kind of a transition mode of dealing with development coming and how do they regulate existing development areas and areas to be developed, and then just rural areas that probably aren't going to be developed for maybe a few decades. So I'm going to try to maybe stop here and see if there's any specific questions you'd like me to maybe address.
Larry, I've got a question.
Okay.
I own a lot on a resaca in South Texas, and I have ownership halfway out into the resaca, but I still pay for water usage from that. Is that okay? I mean,
yeah. The question you're asking, which is a good question. Who owns the resaca the actual water course itself and who owns the water that's in it? Those are two different questions, and there may be two different answers. Okay, the water that's in it is owned by the state, which therefore you need a permit, a water rights permit to be able to use it, and you're going to pay for it. Who owns the channel, the bed and the banks of the channel, the water course that's carrying that water, can be owned by the landowner, the adjacent landowner. A lot of folks might own their land, their deeds say they own to the center of the river, center of the creek, things like that. There's another statute under, I think, Texas Parks and Wildlife Code that talks about any water course that has a top width greater than 30 feet. That particular water course is owned by the state. That's another issue as to whether they really own it, or does the landowner have some deed? And again, there's exceptions to it. Do you have a deed that you can track back to the time that, Texas took over the land from Mexico and all this stuff, as to whether or not that particular water course may be exempt? So who owns the water is totally different than who might own the water course itself. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
And Larry, we do have a question in the chat. It was from Augusta, and he can certainly elaborate on this if I don't get it right. But he's asking, is a man-made drainage ditch / floodway considered a water course under the TWC/TAC? And if so, is it safe to determine that the water belongs to the state in that case?
That's another good question. And there is some case law that says the water course has to be a natural water course. And so obviously a man-made ditch or channel is not natural. There's other case law that says, oh no, once it goes into a ditch or channel, it becomes state water. I think in the situations I've dealt with, a lot of times it gets very, very case specific. It may also depend on what court you're under and their particular case law that you're dealing with. So it's, I've seen cases go different ways on what I would consider to be a fairly simple question.
Looks like, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Larry, for the question. I know it's confusing, but it's always here in Hidalgo County, the drainage district was able to divert water from their main drainage ditch. They bought land and they're building reservoirs, and they're planning to use that runoff water that is in their easement to then sell it for irrigation or water utilities and things of that nature. So I was just confused, or by how you explain the water code and the administrative code. So that's what I was. I asked that question. So I guess they were able to get it. I don't know.
A drainage district diverted water, and so that they could capture it and then sell it?
Yeah.
And where they diverted from?
From their own drainage ditch.
Okay. So their own drainage ditch, and the water that's feeding into that drainage ditch is all diffused surface water?
Yes, it's all runoff from other municipalities and the county. It's so the storm drainage systems of a lot of the municipalities connect to the drainage district system, and that's where they're getting the water from.
there's, and again, this gets more into Texas water law. There's a whole different issue. But there is some statutes and rules and laws that relate to, for example, folks reusing water, which is kind of basically what they're doing. They're capturing it and then basically using it and selling it. And I'd be curious to look into that particular issue.
Okay.
Because I'm not, it sounds like they may not be, because a lot of the statutes kind of limit, you know, how you use water, and they're basically sound like they're using it for commercial purposes. And the question is, because once water gets into a water course, and that water course definition is pretty broad, it becomes state water and it can't go back. And so unless either they got a permit from the state or they've gone through that legal interpretation have determined that no, that's their water. If it's their water, they can use it. I'd be looking at, is it really their water?
And the reason I bring that up is because that sounds like an opportunity for communities to, you know, invest in drainage and be able to get some sort of return on their investments while providing drainage and decreasing flood risk in their community. So I think it's worth exploring the case and maybe replicating it.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I have another question. I don't want to overtake the whole thing, but it's going back to what Tony asked regarding the resacas and who own the water course and the water. I know that some of the resacas in the Brownsville area are used for drainage and water. But yes, the owner has, you know, I mean, the property owner owns up to the middle of the resaca.
Right.
And that when there's no drainage, I mean, the rain event or water flowing, those areas are used for storage. And sometimes it belongs to the irrigation district or utility district or so on. So I don't know if could there be a case for a property owner to maybe get some compensation for them, you know, letting them use their land to provide drainage and storage, or not?
Possibly for storage.
Okay.
Versus flowing water, because there is another concept called kind of a natural drainage easement. So downstream landowners, there's an easement on their property for natural water to be able to flow through it. And so that downstream property owner has to let that water be allowed to flow through their property, and they can't block it to the detriment of anybody else. Okay. And the upstream landowners therefore have the right to send natural runoff downstream, knowing it can't be blocked. So in these resacas, if it's, you know, the natural flow that's coming down those resacas, there's arguably an easement basically given to upstream landowners that allows that water to be able to pass through. Now, when it gets stored, that's a different problem. Does that easement allow storage? And I again, I'd have to look at the particular case, but there's maybe an argument it doesn't allow storage, just allows flow.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, the reason I bring that up is I'm just trying to think of incentives, not only for local governments, for also property owners to help with drainage and stuff like that. So thank you.
Yep.
Is there time for another question?
Yes, let's get that quick question. Sure, Kate.
Okay. Yeah, this is Kate from Texas Sea Grant. One of the issues that was brought up in our previous meetings with the Cameron and Willacy people was, I might not be able to explain this as well as someone who lives in Willacy County. So if there's anybody from Willacy County who could explain this further, that would be great. But one of the questions that came up is that there's a very large ranch that is in eastern Willacy County. It's kind of the end of the line. So the water that drains from Hidalgo and Willacy County, it's all draining out to the Laguna Madre. And it has to pass through this private ranch land. So I think there are some questions about the legality around, you know, who is responsible for that pass through. I'm not using the right terms, but Larry, do you understand what I'm asking?
Well, I understand the scenario you're setting up. I'm not sure what the issues are. As water's going across that ranch land or any ranch land, again, to the extent that water is considered diffused water, meaning it's shallow flow across the surface of the ground and not confined into I'll call it a well-defined or definable channel, ditch, swale. Diffuse surface water belongs to the landowner. He can pretty much do a lot of what he wants with it. Once it falls into this quote unquote water course, it belongs to the state. And then a ranch owner basically touching that water, blocking that water, impounding that water, basically needs permission from the state unless he has an exemption for, you know, some limited purposes. And so if the issue is what can that landowner or ranch owner do to alter, affect that drainage, that's one question. And again, it depends upon whether it's state water or landowner water, and to know which statutes apply. Generally, he can't do anything that's going to adversely impact somebody else. If the issue is what obligations does he have to make sure the water gets to where it's supposed to go?
Yeah.
You know, if that's the issue, I don't think he has any obligations to, I'll say, help the water. You know, he just has restrictions on not blocking it or diverting it or impounding it. Kind of like the discussion earlier about, you know, can the government, do they have a duty to prevent flooding? No. Do they have a duty to improve drainage? No. But once they do, they have a duty to maintain it. And same thing here. Landowner doesn't have a duty to help the drainage or flooding situation that may be on his property or off his property, but he has a duty not to adversely impact it.
So if there are gates, floodgates or drainage gates on his property,
he shouldn't have them unless he has a permit or it's controlling diffuse surface water. And probably if it's a gate or a floodgate, it's in a water course,
right?
Which is why there's a gate there. And that then generally would require getting permission from the state.
From the state, not from the county?
Well, unless from the county, if the county has a regulation dealing with it.
Okay.
Some counties don't. Some counties only have regulations that deal with floodplain. You know, they have their floodplain regulations, their minimum NFIP floodplain regulations, which don't deal with development outside the floodplain.
Right.
Which is a big problem for a lot of developing communities, where you have all this development going on outside the floodplain and it's not being regulated as terms of how it might affect the floodplain.
Right.
Counties have to adopt those regulations. You'll hear from Ataul, from Harris County, they have all sorts of regulations about development throughout the whole county, whether it's in the floodplain or not, to deal with potential impacts that development might have or alterations to the land might have on the floodplain.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Larry. If certainly if there's more questions, I don't know, Larry, if you're going to stick around during the lunch, if people want to have some more questions during that time, but otherwise we'll, send me questions and we'll see if we can get those answered with you, Larry, and
Yep.
Have any follow-up on that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And if you, thank you. And Ataul, if you want to share your screen, we are going to, Larry provided a nice segue right into Ataul with his last comments there. So our last speaker before lunch is Ataul Hannan. He's a director of planning at the Harris County Flood Control District, and talking about the engineering model and map management system that they use for their flood engineering models. And Ataul, looks like you're all set. Please take it away, Ataul.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I start, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think yes. So I see the activities going on. So today I'm going to present on the model and map management system. So I'm not going to go with the regulation up here. So kind of giving a story, because this one is very dear to me. And, I have been working on this for the last 15 years. So many things to tell, but I'm limited with the time. So I will try to go as fast as possible. But the one thing note I like to take for everyone, just to give a note from the overview, is the system that I'm going to talk about, you don't have to copy it, because it's based on the condition that we have on the ground, the team players that we have. So I just want to get the flavor from my presentation is, does it bring any importance by doing it? Yes, what benefit we get out of it by doing it? And remember, if you want to do it and proceed with it, it is a team player game. It's not like I rule everything, yes? Because when water falls from the sky, it flows everywhere. We talk about ditch and county boundary, state boundary, whatever it is. Flooding is flooding, yes? And if we want to deal with it, we need to all work together. So with that notion, I'm starting it. You have a lot of flexibility, don't have to copy it, but just remember what I'm talking about. So I'm going to give a little bit background of Harris County, talk about model management, and then we'll talk about a little bit benefit of it. So this is where we are in location to the state of Texas. We are very flat, very, very flat, okay? So our situation, like, if we have a half a foot of, difference in modeling, it probably goes half a mile long. So that's why the sensitivity of depth of flooding is so important. Probably in many of the places, you already are blessed with the relief. So you don't have to go like us. But I'm just explaining, only like we call it a mountain on the left side, you see it with the, if you can see my marker. On the west northern side, we call it hill, but that hill compared to any places, it's just like playground. So I'm just giving some example to it. But you can see more or less 75% of the county is very, very flat, even though we are big, 1,800 square mile we are talking about, and population 5 million plus. So regarding open channel, because I'm coming from flood control, so I will tell a little bit about us, is we have 1,200 miles of channel modeled. But in reality, if you look at our responsibility, we have 2,500 miles of channel. So this is our mission statement. Again, remember, that's why I'm bringing those notion is look at our responsibility. Every entity has their mission statement and they need to stay within it. And that's why when we talk about various partners and players, we need to respect those, because otherwise the team doesn't work. So our responsibility is to develop flood reduction project for this area. And we are very known. Every probably couple of years, you will see us in the newspaper, Houston flooded again, okay? So we are very well known for that. So remember, we have flat terrain, our soil type is clay, and we have intense rainfall and frequent flooding. So our jurisdiction, so it is very important to note who has what authority, because we cannot cross over each one, yes? So we only have authority on this 2,500 miles of channel. We don't have on streets and drainage. These are the communities. We have 34 floodplain administrators within the Harris County. So remember, there are many players into the game if we really want to talk about resilience or we want to improve flood condition. So let's talk about, we always talk about floodplain and so forth. So this is what we have. We are 1,800 square mile in size. If you talk from the FEMA standpoint, we have 144 panels. Each red box is a panel. And out of this 2,500 miles of channel, we have around 1,200 miles of detailed study, the blue areas that you were saying. So they identify the flooding condition. The rest doesn't. Sometimes people say, well, your map is wrong because my, if you look at a paper map, it's white. I say it is not identified, okay? You have a risk everywhere you live in Harris County. That's why I say, if you live in Harris County, if it rains on your rooftop, you have a chance of flooding, okay? It doesn't matter what color it is showing, but the risk is there if you live around. And Harvey taught us, even around us, if you live 10 counties around us, you have the same probability. So just give you the scale of work that we do, and you can see the floodplain. And my notion today is, let's see who are the players, okay? Because that is very key for success of a teamwork. And what I'm talking about model management, if we really want to do it, we really have to play with the team. It's not alone, because you see, we are only responsible for drainage for 2,500 miles in Harris County, not others. But when you want to solve flooding problem, it includes everything. And I'm not talking about TxDOT or anybody. Again, when you start a game, you cannot include everyone because then you cannot solve it anymore. So you have to see the key players. So we're looking at floodplain. So FEMA is the authority of any floodplain maps. In most of the places, except probably us, the model authority is on FEMA. They have the authority. If you want to ask model, you have to go to them. The 34 communities that I was talking in the middle, FPA, okay, they give permit. Yes, anything you want to build, anything you want to do. So if you say no adverse community, it's FEMA, everyone is playing the game. You cannot be just alone and have your own rule. And that's most of the community have, Before I came with this idea of model management, I'm going to talk about, because this was I presented in 2003, I think, in the TFMA conference. And then I pitched this idea of model management to flood control. And I joined flood control in 2005. So I will tell you the story, but I have to cut it due to time. But you can see our mission statement is to develop flood reduction project. If I don't have a good map, if I don't have a good model, and if I don't have a model that other recognizes, if I do anything, everybody will criticize, because I will say this benefit, they will say no. I will take another model, I say no, there is no benefit. So we have to have a common ground where we all agree, right or wrong, that's not the question. The question is, we all have to work together if we really have to come up with something. And working together, we all know we cannot have an ego on our head and try to solve it. We have to work together. And that is the mentality of model management, that we see, okay, this is his authority. Let's see how can I help you and how can you help me in the most legal way. That's the bottom line. We all have to have positive attitude, and we all have to look for good for every one of us. So that opportunity came, sometimes flooding brings opportunity, okay? So this is the tropical storm Allison that happened in 2001, okay? So that happened, FEMA and Harris County Flood Control work together, because you see, always flood control invest on models, because that is the key. If I don't know what is the risk, how can I solve the problem? Yes, so it is tied with our mission statement. So after 2001, there was a tropical storm recovery project. We invested 16 million from flood control and 16 million from, so 32 million. But what it brought is, in every data that we are talking about, I'm not going into detail, every data that we are talking about is on the same plane. That means if you are talking about HMS, it has the same version of model. HEC-RAS, it has the same version. LiDAR. So I looked at that opportunity, and I was working in that project from the FEMA side. I was not at flood control at that time. So I looked at the opportunity and pitched that idea that this is already in a uniform. We are all starting at a point. Can we start this model and management system? Because what it does, it maintains the model. Because you will see every community after 10 years, everybody debates which is the right model. And then if you put 5 engineers, you will have 6 answers. And then we debate and we have 7 answers. Yes. So we have to start somewhere that we all agree. That's model management. So pitched that idea in 2004 and joined flood control. And the main goal of flood control from my point at that time was, how can I protect the investment that we have done? Because this is taxpayer money. How can I save it? How can I have more value of that? So, and also, if I want to work with the players that I talked about, what is their deficiency? And how can I actually provide better information to all these players? They are developing regulation within their floodplain. Yes, impact analysis, how they can improve, how they can base their information based on the best available data, not old data or debatable data. So looking at the limitation of the players, we came up with the solution. And the solution is, again, the main goal is to continuously manage. So if you see in any community you go, after 5, 6, 7 years, everybody has their own version of the model. Okay. And then you have a floodplain map, which nobody wants to agree upon. So what is the value of all these things that we are developing? And after 20 years, we develop a new map. It's completely different than before. People don't have trust on us. You get my point? So what we wanted to do, we continuously want to manage. And that's why we looked at what are the things that we should be looking for. So if you look at locally, the players, not FEMA, when we look at a solution or a modeling approach, and it is very common, if you put 5 engineers, they will have 6 answers. I'm just making it up because I'm an engineer, I'm criticizing myself. But it is true because there are many ways of doing it. When you go in the field of hydrology, hydraulics, you cannot say anyone wrong, okay? Because there is assumptions going on. But then remember, if I am standing up in front of general people and I say, this is right, this is right, this is right, all 6 of them are right, they're going to look at me and say, I think he is drinking something because everything is right to him. Yes. So from the management standpoint, I have to come up with only the best solution, and it needs to be very transparent, and I can explain them in that way. They have trust on me. So that's why we did the local, because this is not FEMA regulation. FEMA is when you go to Lomar and others, you have to follow those regulations. Local regulation, because our terrain is flat. So here we have all flexibility. We developed and we agreed upon all this modeling standard and the limitations of every model, how we are going to do, and the best possible. So we developed standards for modeling, standards for GIS, so we did everything in this model management, which is within our control. Because see, this is within. FEMA is not going to invest money for local issues. We have to solve it. This is how we share with everyone. And then we are talking with the 34 communities, how we can help them. So these are some of the things. Since our terrain is very flat, we have to control version. We have to control no truncation. So these are some of the examples I'm showing. Then what happens, since it is a big community, there are a lot of development going all around. How do you record those? Normally, if you do Lomars, which changes the map, Clomar is a conditional, so I'm not showing here because it's a proposed thing. Lomar will change the map. So when Lomar comes, how do you record this? If Lomars are happening side by side, the challenges that we face in Harris County, how do you communicate? So all these things were considered when we did the model management, and we did it in a way, continuous is the LOMAR that we are talking about. When small development like LOMAC and other LOMA and other things are going on, we look at the metrics, and after certain years, we do watershed update because we have to keep it. M3 system is just remember as a file cabinet where we are keeping it and we are distributing among people. And it has certain rules, like when FEMA approves it, it's an approved model because we are following everybody's rules and regulation, bringing it into the package, okay? And that's how you see how we are putting every box of everyone's activity into one place. So we did a mapping activity statement with FEMA because FEMA is giving us that we will be the custodian of the model. So we are doing certain regulation. We are doing a memorandum of understanding with the 34 communities. And you see, since they have resource limitation, we are actually helping them technically. So I'm going very fast because of the time, but you see a lot of efforts and you can get those slides later on. But I just want to have in memory that you have seen something that I showed. So the way we did it is all the local things, local limitation, local regulation is solved before FEMA LOMAR comes into play. So it is just, we are taking care. So all teams are working together to have a seamless. So once a LOMAR has been approved, then you go with the master data and how distribute to FEMA and everyone. We started our M3 system, I joined in 2005. In 2009, we signed this document. So we have to have patience. It took 4 years to work with everyone. And this is the system. I'm just showing a picture, but you don't have to follow it. It can be just an Excel spreadsheet, as simple as that. But what it does is brings everybody into the table. And today, after we started in 2010, we started LOMAR delegation. But now we are seeing that everyone within our community, even some engineers who wants to do work, they are calling us to get those models, even that if they don't know where to get it. And what it does is, as you go, because we are notifying people too. So if somebody, you can see all the dots in our dashboard, we see everything. If there are two things going close by close, then we try to sit with them and solve the problem early, then on the 12th hour. And if a new LOMAR is approved, and if they have taken model from us, we notify them with new models anytime there is a change. So we are keeping every partners or every team up to date with the condition. So what it does, maintains model, notifies everyone. If anybody wants to do anything, they will check out model from us, but we are not policing them. We're actually trying to help them with update models, okay? So in 2010, we started, so you saw the previous picture, and we replaced, many communities do LOMAR delegation. But in our case, since we have the authority of the model, if we do the LOMAR delegation the FEMA way, we actually update it. So everything is happening in one place. You can see it, how we lay it out after 2010. And you can see the local people now, they are also playing into the game. So everything is seamless. When they are deciding to do a development, they are looking at it, sending to us. We are working with them with this model and GIS update. So in the end, the LOMAR process goes faster. Yes, because everything has been, all the local issue, FEMA don't have to deal with it. We deal with it. But that helps us. We know that what is the model. So that's in a nutshell, I'm talking about model management. It is not difficult, but we have to start somewhere. And I really encourage, because, started in 2005, 2009, we signed the document, 2010, we launched it. And for 10 plus years, I'm seeing so much benefit. And the benefit is having more partnership with various organizations and working together. And in our area, I want to bring up, there are a lot of, big projects like Braze and other places. We are spending $500 million. This Braze is $500 million of projects. So when we do this big project and they are almost done, we go with watershed update and try to get it effective more quickly so people can get benefit out of it. So this is in a nutshell, the benefit of having and working together and respecting each other with their limitation. And in that way, I mean, after 10 plus years, I can see that, you know, recently after Harvey, you have seen a lot of regulation, very stringent regulation passed, yes? And they were passed very, very quickly. Why? Because we were all working together. You know, they say, use the 500 year. Now the regulation is you have to use today's 500 year. Why? Because we all understand, because we know our model, we know our deficiency, we know in future what challenge we are going to face. So as a team, we are working now. So some of the features that I'm going to show, these are additional. Since we are keeping our map and model up to date, we are offering some current map to the public. So you can go to our website and any person can type, and any LOMA that has been effective, in 24 hours we update. So people can see updated information for general people. For engineers, they can come and see, they don't see all activities, they see some, but this is master user. I see everything going on. So I can plan myself which watershed I should update and when. And we work with FEMA because we are the CTP. We work together. So you see, now we are all working for the betterment of everyone. And all the rules regulation, because again, flooding is an issue. And I agree in Harris County, if you look at development for last 100 years, you will figure it out why we are having problem. So we don't want to repeat next 100 years with that notion. Yes, what has been done in the past, nobody had an intention. But what we have learned, we should pass this forward in future so that the future becomes better. Now, also you see, when we look about event, it is never a uniform rainfall. Yes, you see in the news, Houston flooded again, 100-year event. But if you look at the spatially, if you look at the heat map, look at the blue area. This is the only area that experienced 100-year or more. Yes, if you go in the green area, they are not. So when we talk to people, we have to tell them the risk and why. Like some people have a confidence. Well, I didn't flood in Harvey. I didn't flood in, Harvey is a special case, I don't know. I didn't flood in Ike, okay? I didn't flood in, Tropical Storm Ellison. But it didn't rain there. So you didn't flood. But if it rains, you will have the chance. So we have to explain those. You can see those, what I'm talking about spatially. And we develop, because we maintain the 1,200 miles of channel, because we have a gauge network, because all of the entity agree that this is the model, we are running those to develop live maps. And that helps us to improve our models. Because when you calibrate to an event and you see why it is off or on, you have a better understanding how your model is reflecting. So you see, it's a do loop. The more you do working with everyone, the more benefit you have to get feedback from everyone, and you can improve your system. So these are some of the benefits that you can provide to your people, provide to some entities. And this map, we started in 2018, the near real time. The emergency management, they use that, and it is live. People can look at it, which road is getting flooded, even though it's now limited to only 1,200 miles and only subject to when water is coming out of the bayou and flooding, but not everywhere. So you can see, like for Harvey, we are running the 4 or 5 days event, and every 30 minutes, this one captures how the flooding is happening. And you can see live how the flooding is progressing in our area. So these are some of the glimpses I just want to see. These are some benefit, but remember, we got the benefit after 7, 8 years of hard work. Yes, it doesn't come one day. Like some people come, oh, I like to do it like this way. But I say, look, brother, there is a lot of painful years it will go, and then it comes to this point, okay? So if you just jump that this is gonna happen in one day, you're gonna fail tomorrow. But I'm just telling you a story, it takes a long time to come to this point. And also, since we agree upon on a model, if you follow a process, we can also because we get a lot of federal dollar, yes, state dollar. I have to explain to them as a planning division director, what is the investment? You invested money to us. What is the return of it? Since we all agree with the model, we can come up with some numbers, and you can see these are the numbers that at various events from 15, various events 16, we are actually telling how much benefit you get out of it. And then I don't know whether you know about the map next that we are doing. You can see a lot of things we are considering because we did model management, because everybody knows us, all the players knows how to work with us, and they know that we respect each of them for their rules and regulation. We are able to do map next in such a short time with so much complex modeling. And in future, obviously, the live map that I showed, the near real time, it will cover more or less the 2,500 miles of channel. So you see, with time we improve, but challenge is there. So I just want to give a glimpse of the model management, what it brings to the table. And my last just 2 cents is, we all have to work together and we have to start somewhere. It is a difficult journey, no doubt about it. But if we all work together, stick together, you know, in a difficult county like us, with so much flooding, we are seeing benefit of this system. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you, Atul. There are no questions in the chat, but if we have a few minutes, if somebody has any questions they would like to ask.
Hi, Ataul. This is Steve. I'd just like to add a observation. What I've always enjoyed about what y'all have done and the story that you tell, and I think it's a really important one, and we've seen this in our CHARM workshops, that data and quote unquote the right data is, we're so fixated on that, and it's such the center of our attention, and I call it a trap. It's important, but it's also a trap because there's so many other things going around. And I mean, I jotted down some things that you had on your various slides. Talk about knowledge, access, values, respect, consistency, regulatory requirements, and reducing risk of all these different models. And then I'm very at the tail end talking about learning and patience. And it's tough because we all know that we need these things, but folks aren't asking for it because do we have quote unquote the right data and does it meet the rules, which again is important, but it's not the only show in town. And what y'all have done in the patience and the investment that you have made, and I'm guessing the battles that you have fought, y'all are seeing the return on that. So that's been my takeaway from the work that y'all been doing. And you know, I've been hearing this now for quite a few years. And anyways, I thank you.
No, thank you very much. Actually, I'm very glad that you got my point that I wanted to say, you know, because you see, I am presenting this for last 10 years, okay? Mm-hmm. The takeaway, people, they just want tomorrow to have it. It's right. Not something that tomorrow you will have it. You know, it's not a made package that you copy it and you just put it up there. It's the thing that we have to work together to achieve it, you know. And when you spend some sufferings and pain, you will have a value of it. And then you will all work together. I mean, this is, I'm telling you, I didn't tell the whole thing, you know, but I tell you, I mean, now I know the people, oh, it works. I'm like, golly, 5 years ago, we never talked about those, you know. So you see, it brings, when we have patience and work together, it will have a lot of benefit. And for flooding, I tell you, because we, you know, with cell phone and others, my father, you know, he is in the same field as mine. He talks about, yes, satellite and cell phone. Yes, these are challenging things, but these are all man-made. But a rainfall is not man-made. So it is more challenging. So we all need to stick to that.
And thank you. I'm not seeing anybody come off mute from what I can tell for any other questions. But again, I think if there's any follow-up later, you know, please let us know and we'll try to get those questions answered. So thank you again, Atul. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much, all. Yeah.
So quickly before we do break for lunch, just ask you to stay logged in if you can, so you don't have any reconnection issues. If you don't, please rejoin us. And if you can't join us for the afternoon, if you had registered, please let us know. We do have the afternoon session is a very interactive session with the scenario planning and mapping and interaction with that, and driven by really you all. We're going to be in the smaller groups, and we're going to break out into the smaller groups. So please rejoin, be prepared for that. There will be an overview. Steve will provide an overview of the afternoon, and then we'll be going into those small breakouts, and Madeline will be helping us kind of get everybody into groups to join. The planning exercises with CHARM are going to be focused on an area in the western part of Willacy and Cameron County, but really apply, the exercises you'll go through will apply watershed wide, but you'll start seeing some of the additional data that has been mentioned, the base level engineering data, and then really apply all of the planning, the legal liability issues, everything you've heard this morning to these exercises in the afternoon. So with that, I'm going to say let's break for lunch. We'll be back at my time is it's 2 o'clock Eastern time, but at 1 o'clock your time, we'll be back from lunch and we'll get restarted then. So thank you, and we'll talk to you all shortly. Yeah, and Steve, I guess for everybody's sake, I don't have a lot more to add. Obviously, now we're going to go into the CHARM portion of the afternoon and the exercises, and Steve's going to take over and provide an overview with that, and then work with the team to get everybody into the breakout group. So Steve, I'll let you just take it from here.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a very delicious yet quick lunch, and we're all ready to get back. We are definitely going to shift gears for the afternoon session. So instead of us presenting to y'all, apart from this brief introduction, we will be going into breakout rooms to get a chance to work as a group on a SimCity style exercise. And we'll do a quick introduction here to kind of prepare and anticipate for y'all what we're going to be doing this afternoon. So just to give you a little bit of background, I was actually just looking at this title slide. It's got my name and then parentheses and team. It really should be CHARM team parentheses and Steve. The team has done a great job pulling this all together, and no way we could do this without a large group of folks trying to pull this together on our side, and of course everyone else out here on our workshop today. So some of y'all may know Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Is it clicking? There we go. So we have a presence in all 254 counties in Texas, about 1,400 staff, agents, and specialists around the state. Most of y'all, if you're familiar with AgriLife Extension, are probably familiar with either the 4-H program or the Master Naturalist, Master Gardener program, as well as your ag agents. What you may not know is that here in Clear Lake, Texas, we have a unit called Texas Community and Watershed Partners. And most of our team is here today on today's Zoom. And being part of the university system, we are clearly not in an enforcement capacity. What we are here to do is to train and educate and to provide data and tools. So we don't go around telling people what to do. Rather, we provide perspectives and data and analysis and tools so that stakeholders at the local level can make better decisions. So, and if you're wondering why Leakin is here, he signed the Morrill Act in 1862, which resulted in the land-grant university system. So typically most land-grant universities are the ones with the state extension program. So this is our team. We are part of a new unit in the last year and a half, disaster assessment and recovery. We believe we're the first of its kind for extension in the country. We are what TCWP, what we call the Blue Skies team. So we have 2 teams. We have a planning team and a green infrastructure team. And some of y'all may have worked with us in the past, but a team of planners, geospatial analysts, and of course, folks familiar with green infrastructure and design green infrastructure practices. So just to give you a sense of what we do on the green infrastructure side, we work on everything from, when that's led by Charis, everything from site scale, stormwater management systems, all the way to sort of 100-acre plus landscape scale rehabilitations, for stormwater management and flood control. And then on the planning side, we support communities with ad hoc technical support to support local development of ordinances, higher standards and plans, and certainly being help facilitate locally led processes. And this is what we call our gray skies team. So this might make a little more sense. So looking at about 20 or so specialists or agents who are also housed around the state to support response and recovery efforts here in Texas. So this is a brand new unit. We're still gelling, but it's very exciting that we're a part of this. So yeah, as you can imagine, in blue skies, we help communities when things are kind of quiet and calm and prepare for the future. And of course, we have our team here to help with the response. So a little bit of background. What I want to talk about here for CHARM and what we're going to do today is really an approach to collaborative planning. So we've heard a lot about legal aspects. We've heard about data and a variety of ideas and perspectives to think about how we manage current issues, as well as think about long-term growth and development in our communities. And no doubt there is so much to sort of balance and juggle from the local fires that I know our local officials are continually dealing with, to tax base, and of course working with developers, and the list goes on and on. So what we did starting in 2011 was working on an interactive tabletop interface, which we've called CHARM. And this was a way to help push the technology in the background and engage both technical and non-technical participants. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but it is such a key part of what the CHARM platform is here to help address, and that we want to engage all sectors of our communities and involve them on the planning process. And once we get all those different perspectives together at the table, research has shown that our plans tend to be more stable and more durable. So, and we wish you were here, because what you're going to see is quite a few pictures from workshops that we have done in the past. So to give you all a sense, we have done CHARM workshops for over 24 Texas counties. We've engaged over 1,400 local officials and stakeholders from the community across about 7 years of workshops at this point. We've also done workshops for states around the Gulf as well in the Midwest. So very happy to share some of our experiences and then anticipate for y'all what we're going to be doing this afternoon. So at the beginning, this was from our original pilot workshop in 2011, and CHARM stands for Community Health and Resource Management. And so what you're looking at here are folks working with a do-it-yourself interactive table. So you could, of course, spend quite a few bucks on an interactive tablet or a large TV screen. What we have done here is, you may be able to see in the background on the lower picture, and I think there's some other pictures, I'll be sure to point them out. There's a projector on a tripod that's plugged into the computer that's at the corner of the table. But what we're showing on the table is the actual laptop interface. And this is really great because we get a very large image, and that fills the size of the table. And of course, we can bring a lot of people around the table. And the map is interactive, so you can zoom up and zoom all the way down. You can turn map layers on and off. And then the application that we're using, based on the changes that you make to the map, you will see feedback in real time based on the changes that you're making. And of course, this is data specific to the communities that we work in. So this is not a generic exercise. Today's exercise will be for data from Willacy and Cameron counties. So the CHARM approach was designed to, again, engage a non-technical audience. So I like to use this slide. So John Dewey, in his book, The Public and Its Problems, written in 1927, was dealing with the exact same things they were confronted with that we're confronted with today. And that is the relationship between sort of experts and our elected officials, and then our day-to-day stakeholders and working on the planning projects. And I think one of his quotes that kind of captures where we're at is, the man who wears the shoe knows best that it pinches and where it pinches, even if the expert shoemaker is the best judge of how the trouble is to be remedied. So we have to bring these two halves here together. We can't leave decision-making entirely in the hands of our technical experts, because what we need to bring to the table are different perspectives and that grounded in reality perspective and values that we get from our stakeholders. So how do we bring the two together? And we feel that the We Table and the CHARM approach has helped bridge this gap. So John Dewey, by the way, was a may or may not know, but a very well-regarded American philosopher who wrote quite a few fascinating books on American democracy and the challenges that it was facing back in the day. So the CHARM approach, this platform that we have built, is always envisioned as supporting the human dimensions and analytical needs of collaboration and decision-making. So it can't just be about data and analysis. We have to deal with people, and people don't always think linearly, and we've always dealt with difficult people in the past, so we have to get past that. And how do we bring that together? So our goals is that this is intended for both a technical and non-technical audience. We want to push technology to the background and bring to the foreground the dialogue and let people work around the table. We want to engage them with live mapping feedback. So, you know, it's not just enough to sort of sketch on a map and then have the analyst go to the back office and run the analysis and then bring it out 2 to 3 weeks later. We want to see this in real time, right? That helps the dialogue move forward to kind of test different ideas. We want participants to come to terms with the data in their own words. So this is really important. I mean, y'all could leave a workshop and parrot us about what we talk about, you know, risk data or demographic data or what have you. But it's really important that folks play with the data in kind of an organic way, in a free form way, in an unstructured way, and come to terms by playing with the data, what that data means for the community or for that participant. And of course, we want to bring different viewpoints to the table. And I think we're all familiar with that. And Ataul addressed, I think, a lot of these issues during his, 10, 11 years of building their modeling program. So, so this interactive table, and we'll be not at a table today, but we'll be using this interface, brings together 3 different things. So we have the interactive table, we call that the WE table. We have several pieces of software, basically ArcGIS, and then we have some nice data sets that we've processed in advance to help speed things along. And when you pull these 3 things together, we call that a CHARM platform. So what does that allow us to do? Not only does it allow us to work around the table, it allows us to do some pretty cool things. So we provide very customizable, hyperlocal, interactive, data-driven analysis. So very high quality data. And when we do that, we can do any number of exercises within the application that we have. So we could look at future land use, maybe higher standards for construction, riverine and surge loss estimates. We could look at critical facilities, and certainly social vulnerability is an important component, and then identifying mitigation opportunities. And this is just a sampling of the kind of activities that we could use. Our GIS team and our planners are very skilled at thinking of new exercise based on what we hear from our participants. So this is customizable. What we have today is based on what we have done for many communities in Texas. I will share with y'all that there's no way we're going to get through all of it. There's more than enough to work with today. So this is what we'll be looking at. We're going to take a quick glance at the data, but I don't want to dwell on the data. So we will look at social vulnerability. And this is interactive, so we can turn different layers on and off and different attributes on and off, and the heat map will update in real time. We could look at current and possible future losses based with base level engineering. And we could also maybe come up, well, we will come up with some basic estimates of, $1 million losses, or what is a dollar loss estimate, as well as how many homes would be impacted, right? So we know that there's risk out there, but what's the number assigned to this risk? That helps us put the conversation in perspective. Are we looking at 5 homes, in which case maybe we have other priorities, or are we looking at 1,000 homes? That might change the local conversation. We have a variety of risk layers. We'll take explore some of these. And as we look through the map layers, the data and the mapping helps us identify opportunities for mitigation at the local level. So, and everyone's kind of looking at this through a little different perspective and helping to bring that out in a conversation. This is what we call our SimCity exercise. So you will be able to add different development styles to the map. So each color here on the map represents a different intensity and type of use. So maybe single family homes or a retail center or multifamily housing. All right. Now, what the GIS is going to do is run the analysis for us in the background and spit out charts of what these impacts might look like. And of course, these are land use scenarios that have been developed by other communities during our CHARM workshops. I want to be very clear about something. I may call this a model, or we may call this a model. This is not going to model an ideal or premium planning output. That is your job of planners and stakeholders and all the participants around the table to kind of come to some kind of agreement about what development in the future will look like. The CHARM application will help you see the consequences of these decisions. So this is not making decisions for you. This is helping you understand and interpret the kind of planning options and strategies that we have at the local level. Okay, done with the data, because I think the really important part here is what does engagement look like and what does collaboration look like? So what I have pulled here are some of our greatest hits of some pictures from our previous workshops. So this is Rockport. This is typically very early on in a process, a lot of people sitting around the table, but not leaning in quite yet. The gentleman standing up to the right there is one of our facilitators. So when we have a breakout room, just picture something like this. We're all around a table. There'll be a facilitator. There'll be some folks representing our state and federal agencies to help with the conversation. And of course, all of y'all as local participants. As the conversation goes on, let's say 15, 20 minutes, as you can see, people are standing up. They're kind of leaning into the data and trying out different things. The conversation tends to open up a lot more. We're asking each other questions. So this is sort of the best of what we hope for from public participation. I think we've all had our horror stories of having gone to a public meeting that has gone horribly sideways, people talking past each other and engaging in hyperbole. What's really nice about this is folks sort of standing around the table or sitting around the table and having, for the most part, a fairly respectful conversation and trying to get ideas out. This is actually, that's me in the lower left corner. There is one of our workshops close to Austin. This is a local elected official. Basically, at this point in the conversation, what we were able to show with the CHARM platform is that this is a rapidly growing community, so they need a lot of tax base to support all the infrastructure. So he was generally concerned about restricting development in a 100-year flood zone and even in the floodway. And what we could show through this exercise, and you had a chance to use the paints, was that through higher density development and redeveloping some of our town center, he could still hit the same population targets and more or less hit your same tax base without putting without putting homeowners and families at risk. And again, this is great because it's not me telling the individual, hey, you're making a mistake here. This is everyone around the table kind of having a conversation about, nope, there's trouble down this road. Oh, this could be another strategy that we could use. Keep in mind, all of these individuals around the table, these are not GIS experts. They're not analysts. They're not technical people. This might be a lot of times the first time they're engaging with GIS. So a very exciting exercise here that we have for y'all. So typically when we do engagement, we have a lot of our public safety agencies. We have our planners, city managers, public works, but also hospitals, school districts, power plants, as well as local neighborhood groups as well have been invited and participated in these trainings and events. So just a couple more, but I think it was important to kind of go through these pictures to kind of see what we're able to do with communities around the table and help move that conversation forward. This is from one of our pilot exercises actually in the last year, using this platform to identify mitigation opportunities. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but again, folks having a good time and pointing out issues that they're seeing in the data and having some really, I think, forward-thinking and productive conversations. So again, we wish we were there. We love traveling to the counties around Texas and hosting these workshops. We always get great ideas from our stakeholders about where to eat and where to stay. And it's unfortunate that we miss out on that. So hopefully we'll be down in the Valley sooner than later and get a chance to share and enjoy the best of what the Valley has to offer. So before we break out into our groups, you know, some of our high level goals for today's exercise, look, we want you to explore the data, the tools, and the different planning paints, right? This is just a hypothetical exercise. It's a chance to explore different planning strategies and thinking about future risks. So, you know, as you identify and have a conversation, what does the data and your experience suggest is happening in these maps, right? What are possible activities that your community could support? And what additional data and analysis might be helpful? And then as we wrap things up, thinking about these next steps. So where could this approach work in your community and what activities? What would be the first steps that y'all might take? And then who else would need to be a part of the process? So kind of keeping all these different components in mind as we go through today's exercise. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about CHARM because I think the best way to do this is go into our breakout sessions and you'll get a chance to work with this directly. So before we proceed, are there any questions for me or for our program? Not sure if I'm seeing anything in chat. I can't see chat. Okay, so sit tight. Madeline, are you set to go to put folks into the breakout rooms?
Hey, Steve. Yeah, I'm working on that right now. I'll just need probably a few more seconds.
Okay.
And then I'll let you know in just a sec when I open them.
Right. So what she's working on is actually in the background. She's assigning folks to the different rooms. So we'll be looking at it maybe about 8 to 10 participants per breakout session, plus our facilitators and our workshop organizers. The data that we have today, I think we'll definitely be looking at probably our critical facilities as well as demographic data, and of course looking at risk data and the intersection between where our people are today and maybe how we will grow and develop, and seeing how that intersects with the risk data that we have. So we do have the latest, I believe, unofficial, I don't think it's been fully publicly released yet, Reza, the BLE data?
Yes, it's not published yet.
No, it's not published yet, but it's darn near close to being done. And thank you, Larry Voice, FEMA Region 6, for working with your consultants to get us a sneak peek at this. So how are we going, Madeline?
Okay, they look good. They're all set up.
Okay.
So as soon as I open these rooms, you should be prompted to join. You should get a button that you can click to join. And if everybody's ready, I can go ahead and open those. Yeah, okay, all right, open them.
Okay, it looks like our rooms are all closed. Looks like everyone's rejoined, and so it looks like we're all back. So hopefully everyone enjoyed the chance to do the breakout sessions, get to play with the Charm platform, and hopefully we have some good insights from that session. So we're almost at the end of today, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick debrief with the entire room and go through the breakout rooms. One by one, we'll have someone from each group, for about 3 to 4 minutes or so, share some highlights from the group's conversation. So think about, key takeaways, anything new we learned, other kind of, what were maybe some next steps, opportunities, and challenges you all see moving forward. But so we'll go. We had 4 different room numbers in here, so I might need the facilitators to kind of help point out which room I'm referring to. But we'll go first with breakout room 1. I think that was a group that just got back in here. Reza, was that your group?
Yes, Jessica.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. So thank you again for the awesome opportunity to meet with what I call the experts. I am the community development specialist when it comes to this type of information. It's new to me, but I'm happy to present that what we've learned here, and I think that was most intimidating to me leading on to this workshop, was that we have little to no data collection in our community, and I heard that was even challenging on your behalf. But we did learn from the group, right, and those that are familiar with our area, of the current and possibly future projects in our community, especially in the Sebastian area, the areas currently being studied, and the nearby municipality, which is Lyford. And so it was identified with the help of some of our team members. Some of them have already stepped out of the room, but to identify not just for within the next 100 or the 500-year flood or 100-year flood, but currently what we're dealing with now. And I think most importantly, when we talk about present time, has been that I know I'm very involved with the federal funding as far as reports and with TDM and all that, and some of the challenges that we face. And one of them is that when we do have an event such as a flooding event, it becomes challenging when I personally have to hear stories from our residents that are having trouble with getting funded because they are not noted on those maps as a flooding zone, when indeed they are currently experiencing and have experienced flooding in the past. So I think the updating of those maps is going to be very useful for that, as well as for the current developments in the residential area, which was identified for the Sebastian area. And of course, for some of the commercial, which there isn't too much of that development, but even though our community is growing at a slower rate than the rest of the region, I think that for a reaction, there is a reaction. So it's also going to help us prepare as the other two neighboring counties prepare or are currently developing at a faster rate. So in a nutshell, I think that's what we've learned from this workshop is going to be very helpful for the future development of our community, and that we still have a lot of work to do there. But if once we have the data available, then I think that as a community, it will be more helpful for the future planning.
Great, thank you, Jessica, for sharing all that. Talking about data and making sure that you all have access to that, and your community members as well, being
right.
really priorities
Yeah.
for your future planning and development efforts. So thank you.
Yeah, for flooding mitigation.
Great. Just want to go to the second breakout room. I don't know who is facilitating this one.
This was mine, and Augusto is our presenter.
Hi, everyone. Well, the group convened, and we kind of played with the different scenarios based on some of the information we had of future development. So we pretty much establish a new solar farm, because it's something that we've seen that is coming. We've received applications for solar farms here in the county, so we established one. We let the city of Santa Rosa and city of Primera grow a little bit more. For residential, we had some commercial development, especially along the a road that apparently is going to be expanded to be a connector between Interstate 69 East and I should say Highway 281 and Highway 77. So we just said that that new road will bring some sort of commercial development to some of the areas in the form of strip malls or service stations. And we were able, we also established some conservation areas, and we also pinpoint some flood areas that here our GIS department and the Cameron County DOT surveyed after Hurricane Hannan that were not in the actual flood zones that are in the map. So that was interesting to see both layers overlapped and see those areas that flood and are not picked up by the floodplains. But I mean, this exercise has been great. I think as a GIS exercise, is a great tool to communicate these potential risks to the decision makers, namely our county commissioners and judge, since they are the ones that ultimately approve new subdivisions. So, and that would give us more tools to maybe request no-rise certification for a new subdivision that a developer wants to get approved and stuff like that. So all in all, I think this is a good tool. For counties, it's hard to, since we don't have a zoning authority, it's hard to regulate development as a municipality would do. But anyways, that's just one aspect of this whole tool. So yeah, Tony, do you want to mention anything that I didn't mention?
Yeah, we did add a couple of shelters because this is one of our most frequently flooded areas. We figured we've had 2 500-year floods in the last several years, which hasn't been picked up by, I guess, this map. So we added one for people on the western side, on the eastern side, and then one on the north side for animals, because livestock, it needs to be moved when we do have severe floods to get them, to save them. And then I think you mentioned the natural areas. Oh, we also discussed maybe increasing drainage, and we tried to figure it out where it could drain to. And we discussed the potential of even using large pumps to pump all the flood waters out and have permanent ones, because the county, Augusta said the county has portable ones and they usually have to be pulled into this area. And we have other areas that could be flooded too. So we might need permanent pumps to pump them into the floodway, which bisects this whole area. This was a tough one to tackle because it is frequently flooded. And I think we learned a lot. And I guess the biggest challenge is how we're going to fund all this. And that's about it. Good job, Augusta.
Great. Thank you both for sharing that info. And it sounds like, this group worked a little more on, some of the project and critical facilities implications of flooding and having this new data available. So the drainage and shelters were really interesting to hear about, as well as, continually looking at the data you have available and how to use the best available data to, make informed decisions related to growth and development in flood zones. So, great. Breakout room number 3, this is my group. So Elijah, whenever you're ready.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. And again, a big thank you to everybody who made this possible. It was extremely beneficial as far as the information and the presentation from the beginning. In looking at this type of map and everything that comes into it, I, for one, I'm with intergovernmental relations with the GLO here in the Rio Grande Valley. So my job is to make sure that I'm communicating the needs from the local municipalities, from the county governments up to Austin and vice versa, to make sure that the local governments are aware of what is available to them once we post that information. But, I think the first speaker had mentioned that this is probably the most up-to-date information of its kind for Willacy County. And, as a lot of us know, Willacy County has been heavily impacted in the past with the recent storms and flooding in general. But I think in looking at the capability of this CHARM tool for planning, you kind of see the more complex aspect that goes into it. I think we had used an example of a big box store, and it really just tied back into what we covered initially at the beginning of how that can impact the surrounding area. So it's not just as easy as saying, well, let's go ahead and improve this in this area without thinking about the residual impact in the surrounding areas as well. But we also touched on the idea of how do we get this information out, especially to areas that are repetitively impacted. And I think Erica, Andrew, and I, we shared the idea of, community education efforts, of partnering with local municipalities with this information on hand, nonprofits and even faith organizations to actually get out into these communities, especially when programs are available for folks who maybe live in areas that are repetitively flooded. And they might not even know it or be aware, but they qualify for maybe a buyout program. It could be anything, or something to raise their home. But I think that this type of tool really helps visualize that and put it into perspective, and show our residents that indeed they do live in an area that is severely impacted, and it probably will happen again. And of course, we as private citizens, we want the best drainage, right? We want our problems fixed, but it's not that simple. Especially when we're talking about funding. We need flood studies. It's a little bit more complex than that, but being able to explain this and show this in community workshops, for example, I think would be huge. And I think it would have a greater impact towards the future and mitigation in general, if we also, not only in working with the upper levels of government, but also at the grassroots level. I think that was one of my biggest takeaways here. So incredibly beneficial presentation. So thank you. Thank you all for making it possible.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, I think from this tape room, we heard a little more about communication coordination as being, really important steps to reducing flood risk in the communities. So I think on to our last group, room number 4.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Hi. First off, again, like everybody said, thank you so much for this, for the chance to do this, for the presentation, and for the ability to actually, I guess, interact with a lot of what is the CHARM program. I wasn't too interactive in my group. I was mostly I like absorbing information. I like seeing what's happening. How can I relate with it? And for me, this was, I think, very useful. Mostly, I'm not from Cameron County or Willacy County. I work for Hidalgo County, actually. And a lot of what I was very interested in is, trying to make the connection with how can we use this? How can, how does this apply? And, it was very easy to see that one of the main things that I actually very early on, I think it was Benjamin that mentioned it, how, obviously we're regionally connected, but how floodwater from, just the county just drives itself over to Cameron County, and how they have to work with a lot of that coming over and being able to manage a lot of the areas. I believe it's right in the Isnaga area, how, they manage that with, I believe you mentioned the pumps being used to after the systems, I guess, shut down. For me, a lot of that was very, I guess, interesting and new. And I was kind of going over trying to connect with what it is that, how this happens and how this can be used on our side to sort of help, not just obviously Hidalgo County, but, the whole region as a whole, to better manage a lot of the floodplains.
Oh, great. Yeah, acknowledging the regional connections there and thinking about applicability at a bigger scale. So thank you for sharing all that. I think that's all of our breakout rooms, right? So thank you. Okay, well, I think this brings us to the last couple minutes of our workshop. So I'll turn it back over to Jeff and others for any closing remarks or resources. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for everybody. And I'm actually going to go in a bit of a reverse order from our starting presenters today, with Steve and then John, and then I want to finish up. But I guess always appreciate Steve's overview or kind of summary of these and his thoughts just from the CHARM side and what we just heard from the breakout rooms. And then I want to kind of feed back into John. As we went through almost over a year of planning for this workshop, and then I'll finish up from that. But Steve, did you have any kind of closing remarks you wanted to mention first?
No, I just want to thank everyone who helped bring this together. There's a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different layers, and to pull it off so it's a very smooth event. I'm just really pleased, and I hope for our participants this was a good use of their time. So we've done this for quite a few communities. We have resources to support planning activities, and we will be reaching out for some other trainings that we are preparing for later this spring and the summer. So yeah, hopefully this isn't it. Be hearing from us, or we'll be hearing from y'all. And the most immediate takeaway, I hope that the ideas and the insights that y'all got today, y'all can start applying to the work that you're already doing and are underway. So y'all are doing great work. So thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Steve. And John, I know you had to just step away for a little bit, during some of the breakouts, but, just your overall impression and what we were able to bring to the groups that you've been working with for a long time as well.
Yeah, first I'd like to say thank you to everyone who put together, organized, and presented on the event today. Hugely helpful resources, helpful information. I learned a lot. I'm always learning a lot in these topic areas, and structure of the mapping exercise is a great opportunity to get people to the table exploring options. So thank you for that. But I also want to make sure I say thank you to all the participants. A number of the folks that are on this workshop now have been participating on the Valley-wide team to coordinate on finding solutions to these problems. And I think a participatory mapping exercise is a great opportunity to show how it's very much a partnership effort. So the fact that we have folks here from all the counties and the Council of Government and the municipalities and all of the organizations that are working on the ground with people to help manage these properties and the flood risk that everyone's exposed to and how these are changing over time. Everyone's participation here is a great example of folks coming together and acknowledging that these are challenges that need to be faced together and finding paths and partnerships to go forward on making that happen. So thank you very much to all the participants for continuing to work on these challenges.
Thanks, John. And as I'm looking at the screen here with everybody on there, I definitely want to thank all of the CHARM team. As Steve said, we saw Steve's name and then the team. Like getting all of this done, we wouldn't be able to do this without them, all the coordination with this. So I'm pleased to recognize them and really thankful for them to have joined, or that we're working with such a great team as that. You know, I know it's been a long day, so I don't want to take a lot more time. And, you know, part of the goal of this is over the years, we've been listening, you know, looking at trying to coordinate and arrange speakers and topics, is making sure we're answering all of your questions. And all of the speakers, as they departed or as they left, had reminded me that if you want any more information, please let them know or let me know, and I'll pass along that information to them. So I can give you contact information, so that they all want to help, I guess, if there's any further questions. So please let them know. We will be posting all of the content again on our website. And because I think we have everybody's emails, once that's available, I'll probably send out a email blast to everybody letting know when the presentations are there, the recordings and any other materials, or just please look at the sites as you go. You know, so I hope we achieved our goal in answering a lot of your questions throughout the day with our presenters. But one thing I just reflected on as we were listening to this, that I hope we also were able to bring, I guess, the spotlight to Willacy, to Cameron, Hidalgo, and the communities on the data needs, on the needs of the communities around flood risk, flood management, and, you know, trying to bring these groups and bring the data in there. So I'm hoping that, you know, we were helpful in that way too, and it's not just, you know, maybe a one-way street all the time. So really appreciate that, and for everybody that joined. And it was really nice to see it actually expand beyond Willacy and Cameron, and really look at the watershed as a whole in that way. So on that, I am going to end it. I don't have anything else unless there's any last words from anybody that wants to come off mute. I'm happy to hear somebody else. We got 5 minutes, not that we need to use all of those 5 minutes, but and if not, please email me anytime. As Steve said, you know, if there's something more that we can do, let us know. I did put the evaluation link into the chat as a final reminder that we would love to hear how we did. We do use that information, and we will use it to improve if there's areas that we should improve upon. So with that, thank you to everybody that joined, and have a great week. And please give me a contact if you need anything else.
Great job. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.